Hello and welcome to Adult Music, the podcast with music for the mature mind. I'm your co-host, Russ.
And I'm your co-host, Mike. Yeah.
And we're here with episode 106 this week. And it's a keyboard feature this week. We've got lots of piano-based and other oddities.
Lots of keyboard instruments. It's almost like the keyboard museum this week. We have we've got almost everything.
And it's getting pretty warm here in Japan. After a snowy winter this weekend, you could almost go out with short sleeves on.
Indeed, I went out with short sleeves just yesterday, and I sneezed all the way through because I seem to have allergies, and I'm still suffering from that now, so there may be a lot of edits to today's program.
You're looking like you're going to sneeze right there.
So I just went through town, like sneezing all over the place. I may take a trip to Sneezy Town during this podcast, so if I'm missing, just that's where I am, just so you know.
All right. And before we get into all of our keyboard features, I want to remind everyone that in the episode description, you can find links to Spotify and Apple Music for all the music that we're going to talk about. Also, at the top of the description, there's a link to the full episode playlist. It's all the music in one place on Deezer, our favorite CD quality streaming platform. You can follow us there at username Adult Music Podcast and get the playlists and the podcast all in one place. Also, if you can't see the full description or recording list on your app and the links aren't active, you can always come over to our host site, Podbean, podbean.com. Everything's easy to follow there. And if you enjoy the podcast, please follow or subscribe wherever you listen to us and tell a friend. Word of mouth helps get us new listeners. Any music-obsessed friends you may have, those are the kind of people we're looking for. If you also give us a ranking, take a minute to write a short review. That helps us get listed in the browsing category recommendations, and it's another way we can grow our audience. You can also come over, follow us on our Facebook page to get extra info, more new releases throughout the week. There's a lot that came out this week in jazz that I put up there. You can leave a message or comment there, and you can see our interaction with the artists if they respond to our links up to their recordings. And you can also get in touch directly by email if you'd like. Our email address is adultmusicpodcast, all one word, at gmail.com. And we got a message this week from someone who's checked out our podcast, John Krosnick. And
cool.
He's at Stanford University. So we've got a high-level listeners. That's
in California, Stanford University. He's a professor there?
He's a professor. And he plays drums in a couple ensembles. And he asked if we would, talk about his music. And they have 2 albums that came out in 2021. And, generally we try to keep it within a few months of new releases. But I told him I would check them out. And they're really good recordings. And so I want to actually recommend them to the listeners. So he's got 2 groups. One group is the Charged Particles. And this recording is live at the Baked Potato. Play the music of Michael Brecker. And you got to have your stuff together to play Michael Brecker's music. And they do. It's a really good recording. And that's on Summit Records.
Yeah, not only that, but if you're making albums of Michael Brecker's music, you're automatically got Russ's ear. I just want to mention that.
For sure. And the other one is the Lunar Octet, and this is some Latin jazz, and it's also really good. It's called Convergence, also on Summit Records.
Now, this sounds like my kind of ensemble.
Yeah, they're both really good. So I'll put the information and also links to streaming at the end of the episode list there for listeners' convenience. And by all means, if you guys have more new music coming out in the future, John, get in touch again and give us a heads up.
Yeah, if it's like that, I think we give it a listen and talk about it. That'd be cool.
It'd be really good.
Yeah.
Also, we're sharing our audience with some other podcasts you can check out. We've got Tom Gauker's podcast, Something Came from Baltimore, Jazz, Blues, and R&B Interviews. He's got some interesting stuff happening every week there. He's got a pretty active Facebook account. You can look that up there as well. Famous Interviews in Neon Jazz. That's by Joe Domino, who interviews artists, musicians, and writers. And then Same Difference, 2 Jazz Fans, 1 Jazz Standard. And that's a podcast that looks at several versions of the same jazz standard each week. And they play little bits of each one and discuss the history and the different versions of that. Mike's been checking that one out. Yeah. And you can find descriptions and links for all of those at the end of the podcast description as well. So if you're looking for some more music podcasts during the week, do check those out.
Yeah, I've been enjoying that one too. I'm getting a little bit of an education about the history of some jazz tunes that I've been hearing all my life, but don't really know much about. It's pretty cool. Yeah, these guys are really knowledgeable.
Because, we at least get a few every episode here that pop up in the jazz section. So it's kind of nice to know the history and also see what people have done with them over the course of jazz history. So.
Exactly, yeah. My things, we often talked about this. I love the poetic titles that a lot of traditional jazz tunes have. And one example would be Softly as in a Morning Sunrise, like a classic. And I never knew it had words until I actually heard... I forgot who it was now. You see, this is why I need that podcast. But I was pretty surprised to know that it actually had words. I just figured it was a tune,
Right.
All right. So where are we? Are we ready to go? Any other announcements?
I think that's it for now. I've got a few other interesting tidbits, but I'll relate them to the material.
There's some good stuff coming up. Yeah. Okay. So we are now going to enter the Keyboard Museum. And I'm kind of wondering, first of all, have you ever seen the movie Voyage to Italy by Rossellini, Roberto Rossellini? Did you ever see this movie with Ingrid Bergman? It's a movie it's an Italian movie. I think there's an English version of it too, about a married couple, and they go to Naples, and they go to the museum, which I've kind of been to, the sort of archaeological museum, and they see all these like ancient statues from the ancient world in Rome, and it kind of like moves them deeply, and kind of like they wind up kind of fighting and I guess separating at the end of the movie. They don't really separate, but they kind of grow a little more distant because of that. So I was kind of thinking about that because of all these like artifacts in the museum. And we have some keyboard instruments on this first album. This album is called Perpetuum by let's call him a keyboardist, Anthony Romaniuk. He's Australian. And this is on the Alpha label. Now this album has a theme, Perpetuum. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. He's chosen a program of all pieces that have like perpetual motion in them. Now, in some cases, this is really what drives the piece, but in other cases, it's just constant arpeggios that just sort of, sort of create a bed that the rest of the melodies are happening to. And this is his second album. The first one was called Bells, and bell sounds in keyboard music, and I am a big fan of bells, and that's one of the reasons why I love the piano so much, is because of its decaying quality. So to me, it reminds me of bells. Here in Japan, we have bells. We have the Buddhist bells. They're really deep and low, and they sustain forever. I mean, they're really incredible. But I really love the European church bells, like especially at noon, when if you're in a big city like Paris or Rome or Florence, like all the bells in the city go off, and I just love that sound. It kind of makes me wish I were there.
I want to say about this one before you get into it, this will become apparent after people understand what's going on. But if you haven't listened to this yet, this is not the kind of album you just throw on in the background, because you won't get anything out of it. You really need to find the notes for it, or what we're going to talk about here, because the collection of works is around this theme of motion, perpetual. But each track is performed on a different instrument for a specific reason. And so in order to understand and appreciate it, you kind of need to know what those instruments are and why he chose them for each piece. And this is really getting at the heart of adult music.
I guess, It's an interesting program, I have to say. It's one of these concepts that I've never seen in classical music. I, as a classical music spokesperson, let's say, I'm trying to get away from the whole the whole snobby past of classical music. I really think we should be listening to this as normal music. Now, it takes a little bit of understanding to really get into it, but you can listen to it casually too and not really know what's going on. But that's really, to me, an entry point. You really want to learn more and more and more. Anyway, the interesting thing about this is that Romaniuk, I had mentioned his Bells album, but this one's is called Perpetuum. And he thought of this one because this theme, because he said that he remembers in his childhood that he noticed the communal bliss that would overtake an audience at concerts, and it was usually produced by works with hypnotic, trance-like, and ongoing rhythms. And he wanted to find music embodying that quality for this album. Now, I had this experience too. It was really interesting. We're going to hear, there's a Philip Glass on this album, but I heard Philip Glass's opera Akhenaten, which is about the Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten, who introduced the idea of a single god, like monotheism, into like ancient Egypt. This is long before Christianity, Buddhism, all of that. When everything was polytheistic. This was in his earlier period, so it was all those like repeating arpeggios that kind of drive you crazy. And I never really liked this. It just kind of sounded like piano lessons to me. But when I heard this opera, what I got was these arpeggios. They suddenly change like harmony, like one note will change, and then 3 minutes later another note will change, and just this slow change kind of gave the idea of like time passing by, like the centuries. Like it had some kind of epic kind of quality to it. And then I got it. I sort of said, okay, this is one thing that you can do with this sort of music. Glass's music doesn't really sound like that as much anymore, but then it was just kind of very. He didn't really use timbral color in those days either. It was just like the piano sound, and it was just these repeating tones, and it would just subtly change. And it really put you in a state of hypnosis. And I remember that from even hearing that opera. It was quite an experience. Anyway, in today's culture, we're living here in the 21st century now. Boy, the 20th century wasn't so great, but I don't know. Maybe it was better than the 21st century. At least the late 20th century was really fun. The later years. In today's culture, anything with a repetitive beat, so that means all pop music basically, has this trance-inducing quality. If you've ever been to a rock concert, you've probably experienced it. It really brings the crowd together. Mm-hmm. Also, music that's part of the ancient musical traditions have it, particularly with those with a ritualistic or sacred context. Even if you think about, not even Western music, but if you go to other cultures, you'll hear a lot of repetitive beats, and this kind of hypnotic quality like brings the community together in some kind of ritual way. Romaniuk, in his notes, also says that improvisation has been included in this album both as a chaos agent, I guess to break up the repeating patterns, and in order to lend his own quasi-compositional voice to the tapestry. He thinks the improvisational spirit in a session infuses the composed works with freedom and spontaneity. It's an interesting idea. I think that's probably true. Okay, and he really does kind of stick to the whole idea of perpetual motion here, even in pieces where you wouldn't really think it would be. And the first piece he plays on this is by our own American composer, John Adams, not the second president, the composer, who's still alive. He's contemporary. And this is China Gates. And I've been hearing this piece, I think, since when did it come out? I'm pretty sure I've heard this in the 1980s, or at least the 1990s. I've heard this played before by other pianists. It's fairly popular, but Romaniuk takes a more careful, precise, and slow approach. When I've heard this, it's always been faster than it is here. And Romaniuk's approach, to be honest, pays off. All the beautiful tones of this piece are clearly heard on an excellently clear recording. I should mention he's playing the piano, the modern grand piano on this piece. It's got this nice bright tone. And there's something about the holding back of the tempo that adds a sort of hypnotic quality to the piece. The piece is reminiscent of chiming bells. Think about Debussy's piano piece, Pagodas, if you know that one, or just a bell piece. This could have gone on his previous album too, but it's just kind of these repeating motions. Think of a Balinese gamelan. That's Indonesia, that's not China, but even so, it's kind of the same sort of idea, I think. Anyway, this is a nice performance of that. Next, Eric Satie, Pièce froide, which means cold pieces. I love Satie. He had a way of, he had a knack for naming his pieces. And I love these three. They're actually very similar to each other. And Romaniuk, I think, rather wisely separated them on this album and plays each one of the three of them on a different keyboard instrument. This one is on the forte piano, the first one, Danse de Travers 1, number 1. On the forte piano, this is the piano that was in action from around Beethoven's time. So it's actually predates Satie, but he's going to play these on different keyboard instruments. So he's not really too concerned about historical authenticity here. Anyway, on this one, I like the variety of sounds that the different keyboard instruments get. And this one's more kind of matte sounding than the piano that we heard in the previous track. And by matte, I mean like it doesn't have a gloss or a shine to it. It's just kind of, it absorbs the light, let's say, or whatever, if you know what I mean. I think of the sound of the forte piano as kind of brown, sort of like a floor that doesn't have a shine or something like that.
It's a duller tone. It doesn't shimmer out.
Yeah, and it's quite a contrast from the previous track, which had this real chiming, glowing sort of sound to it. Anyway, Romaniuk captures the early 20th century quality of this piece well in his playing, as well as in his choice of instrument. Okay, so this works well on the forte piano, as it turns out. The third piece is Johann Sebastian Bach, our good friend. This is arranged by Romaniuk himself. This is from Preludes Book 1, which there's no such thing. So he's taken this from, I don't know where he got this from, really. Prelude in E major, BW 1006A. He plays this on the Yamaha CP80. Yeah. Is this an instrument you're familiar with?
Yes. What's funny in the notes is that he says, playing it on this brings it into our modern era. But this was an instrument.
Maybe 40 years ago it brought it into. I don't know.
It was only made from 1976 to 1985. And if you haven't heard it yet, it rather has a electric piano type of sound to it. But I think it was designed to be able to compete in a mix with, amplified instruments and guitars and have that presence on stage. It does have a rather booming quality to it, which is very interesting, though.
I had mentioned here that he, it sounds like he plugged this instrument directly into the soundboard because it's really present. It's right on the surface of the speaker. It just sounds like it's coming out of the...
I think he mentioned the kind of springy and fast action quality this instrument has, and he takes advantage of that here. It's very sprightly and springy.
Oh, he certainly does.
But it's interesting because the tone you'll see the tone is kind of a funny dullness to it.
Yeah, you'll see if you listen. You have to listen. Go to the link and listen to this. Okay. He adds his own harmonies to this work too, so it's not really Bach he's arranged this. Okay, people have done that before for violin work that was transcribed for the piano. Actually, I think this is a transcription of some other work. I'm not really sure which one it is.
Isn't it?
Which one? The Lute Suite.
Okay, 4 in E major. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and he has the appropriate light touch for this piece. There's no pedal, so it's very kind of staccato, and you're hearing all the attacks, which I think is always good in Bach. And there are a few accents in this. It's an enjoyable interpretation. The articulation is all very clear. And the bass, as you would expect from this instrument, is particularly full sounding. Yeah. So if you have a subwoofer, you got to get an earful of bass or maybe a chest full of it too. Track 4, Penguin Cafe Orchestra composition. This is a Simon Jeffs, I think, ensemble, or he's the writer. I don't know. But Romaniuk arranged this. This is where the title track comes from, Perpetuum Mobile, and this is on the piano. Now, again, this is really something for us because we grew up in the era when the Penguin Cafe Orchestra were together. They were kind of considered to be a bit avant-garde at the time because they played various so-called world music traditions, and they would kind of combine them all with a largely Western instrumentation. I mean, these days, we're kind of into this. This is such a terrible word. Whenever it's used, not even just in music, purity. Nothing is pure, okay? I just want to say that right now. There's no such thing, okay? It's a word we use as a reference point. But anyway, so this whole idea that, say, Indian music can only be Indian or something like that has become the norm now, okay? So like Africans playing African music, that sort of thing. But combining the forms is what the Penguin Cafe Orchestra did. And we liked them in the age. Well, I don't know about me. I didn't really listen to them. But they were pretty popular at the time. To be honest, this doesn't sound much different. He plays this on the piano, by the way, does Romaniuk. And this oddly doesn't sound much different in timbre than China Gates, the John Adams piece. It's kind of similar, really. It has more in the way of separate motivic lines. And basically, we're hearing the same repeating figure sequenced upward and downward on the piano. I don't think this is really one of their more exciting pieces, but I don't know. And I thought it was kind of repetitive. The next work, it thrilled me to see this name because I love the music of György Ligeti, the Hungarian 20th century composer. Let me give you a little music history lesson here. After World War II, classical composers decided to completely alienate their audiences by there were people like Stravinsky who continued in his like neoclassical or highly rhythmic style, but a lot of people went the Schoenberg route and engaged in 12-tone music, and nobody wanted to hear that because it all kind of sounded similar. I mean, there were some geniuses who really made it work for them, but most of it was pretty disposable. Anyway, part of the idea, if you think about World War II, the whole discovery of the Holocaust and things like this made people not want to write music with any emotion anymore. Because if you were going to write music with emotion, if it was going to be honest, it was just going to be kind of horrifying in a way. You couldn't really write happy music. So people wrote intellectual music, and that was what happens with 12-tone music. Ligeti found a way around this. He wrote music that had a bit of a sense of humor to it. It was highly intellectual still, but there's a lot of humor in it too. So that was another way to get around the whole anti-romantic concept that came after World War II. We're now out of that, thankfully, with the fall of the Soviet Union. All these East European, or former Soviet countries have really renewed music with this wonderful music with a religious vibe to it, and it's very still, and it's really something we really need these days. So I'm glad they're there. Anyway, back to Ligeti. He wrote his piano etudes towards the end of his life. A lot of them were written, I think he started them in the 1990s, and they went all the way up to around to his death in 2006. He didn't finish the third book, or he did, and then he died. There were only 4 of these in his third book of them. Anyway, this is etude number 4, I'm guessing from book 1, Fanfares. And this is for the piano. You really couldn't play this on any other instrument. He has odder harmony than anything we've heard previously. He's very much a 20th century composer. And the perpetual motion comes from the constantly repeating staccato line in the background as blocky chords are kind of dropped around it. If you play the piano and you listen to this, you can hear how hard this is. To play, just getting your hands around in these kind of patterns. The other hand
is constantly dancing around.
You kind of hear that the hands are constantly. You have this in Ravel too, where one hand is playing over the other, like you have to kind of squeeze your fingers in between the black keys to get some of these lines going. Anyway, there is a comic quality to the piece, as I mentioned, as there often is in Ligeti, that I think is well captured here by the attention to the rhythm rather than by any interpretative indulgence. You can't really interpret Ligeti. You just have to play it like it is on the page, and it comes off really well here. And I have to say, just the fact that Romaniuk can play this piece puts him in a pretty high level of pianist. Okay, now that said, the next piece is Schubert, impromptu, very famous piece, Deutsche 899, number 3 in G-flat major. And this is played on the forte piano, which would have been appropriate to Schubert's time. So you've got that not shiny, matte, dull sort of quality to the instrument. This is probably the most famous work on the entire program. A lot of pianists play it even when they're studying, although this is a kind of tough piece, really, for students. The piece allowed Romaniuk to use the moderator register on the Graf forte piano that he's playing here. To be honest, I don't know what that is. I've never played a forte piano, so I don't know what that is. And it results in a delicate and warm timbral wash. I find this refreshing to hear on the forte piano. With its total lack of gloss, this generally comes across with a lot of gloss on the piano when people play it there. I wish more pianists would record these on the forte piano. My issue with this, though, is Romaniuk plays this pretty straight, and this often has a hard-on-sleeve quality when other pianists play it. The Romantics, they get this really nice sort of emotive quality out of it. This is going to be an interpretation that will have listeners taking sides. If you're like a big fan of a specific recording of this work by a famous pianist, you're probably not going to like this much. It's pretty straightforwardly played, with attention given, of course, to the program's theme, the perpetual rhythm of the bass line. Right? So he's really focusing on that. He's not really focusing on drawing you in with the melody here. And he plays it kind of straight, and that doesn't always work this is kind of on the edge of classical and romantic music. Schubert was really just before the Romantic period, along with Beethoven. Beethoven kind of had one foot in each. Track 7, Shadings, is an improvisation, and this has repeated notes and alternating hand patterns on the Fazioli F228 piano. Now, this is a pretty aggressive repeating note attack, and there's quite a blur of harmony as the pedal is used to get a harmonic blur, but the attack is well discernible throughout. Next, Henry Purcell. Scholars like to call him Henry Purcell now, but I don't know. Anyway, I'm just used to Purcell. A New Ground. ZT, 682? And this is on the harpsichord. The first time we're hearing the harpsichord on this recording. This is a very different technique from the piano, the forte piano. And I have to say, Romaniuk is pretty impressive. He can switch between these instruments. Harpsichord is more wrist action, whereas the piano is more fingers and upper arm strength and things like that, shoulders, things like that. But the harpsichord is all wrist. You're bouncing up and down, basically, to play this. The first time we're hearing the harpsichord here, it's got a silvery chiming sound on this recording with a thin-sounding right-hand tone. The bass is pretty heavy. I don't know. This must be a big instrument, but it's well marked by Romaniuk.
Focus is given to the continuing bass line and middle perpetuum motion line, so as not to, I said perpetuum mobile line, so as it's not the most expressive performance again. The very appealing melody could have done with some shaping. Instead, the steady gliding rhythm that Romaniuk gives it is really what the focus is here. It's a gliding rhythm. It's enjoyable, though.
Yeah, nice sounding instrument.
It's a nice sounding instrument, absolutely. Yeah, a lot of the appeal of this album, by the way, is in the timbre, or the sound quality of each of these different instruments. It's constantly a surprise. Track 9, Eric Satie. This is the Pièce Roide number 2, Danse de Travers 2, and this one's played on the Yamaha CP80, which I'm sure Satie would have liked.
I'm going to take a guess here.
Yeah.
He also mentions in the notes that in some cases he has chosen to invert what the instrument is naturally suited to.
Okay.
And I'm going to take a guess that that's kind of this is one of the ones he's referring to. Maybe we'll find out. But it was just really hard to imagine this piece on this instrument. And so it's an interesting choice. So I'm wondering if it's against type by purpose here.
Yeah, this isn't a sound world that Satie would have imagined, although he was a quirky composer, so he probably would have appreciated it. Anyway, this is interesting because the Yamaha keyboard gets a kind of wood block sound in the bass at the beginning. It's kind of... it's really interesting. The piece works well on this instrument, despite the fact that it was written like 80 years before this instrument came into existence, or 70 years. The recording of the Yamaha makes it sound like it was plugged into the mixing console again. Track 10, Parabola, is an improvisation, and this is played on a virginal, which is sort of a lighter sounding harpsichord. This is the Mussolar virginal, which I guess is a specific one. This improvisation spends a little time in each register of the Mussolar virginal, showing off the different sounds of the different registers, alternating between minor and major chords as if deciding whether to be melancholic or optimistic. We haven't heard this instrument yet. It's more delicate than the harpsichord, but not quite as quiet as the clavichord we heard last week. Mm-hmm. It is pretty quiet, though.
I called it dainty and enchanting.
Yeah, okay. You can imagine being seduced by a woman playing the virginal in the 18th century. At least I can. Anyway, it's a pretty enchanting improvisation, I have to say, with a light dance quality to it, really belying its title, Parabola. I really don't know why he called it this. But anyway, it's a very Baroque era sounding, and perhaps the sound of the instrument causes that interpretation that I'm giving it. I don't know. Parabola sounds a little like a more modern thing, even though I think the ancient Greeks probably found it. Anyway, track 11. Igor Stravinsky, 20th century composer. This is on the piano. It's the first movement of his piano sonata. This has a post-World War II machine-like quality, which was very popular in the early 20th century. You hear a lot of works like this. And it has neoclassical harmonies, which makes it kind of appealing to listen to. Romaniuk plays this with a rather pleasing lack of percussive quality. It's often played like somebody's hammering on the instrument. But here, it kind of sounds like if he's using hammers, he's using hammers with like a fuzzy top on them. They sound like malleted, I guess, more than metallically hammered. Yeah, it's played with a fairly light touch, which is unusual. So he's actually gone against expectations here, and I rather appreciated that. I would have liked to have heard the other two movements, actually. But, of course, they're not perpetual motion, so we didn't on this program. Track 12, Johann Sebastian Bach, Toccata in E minor on the harpsichord. So a pretty traditional interpretation, although I have to say, Romaniuk, he doesn't ever interpret a work according to expectations, and this is the case here. Each section has an element of perpetual motion in this, but the fugue that it ends with has an uninterrupted stream of runs and chordal figures. It is most aligned with the program. This piece starts out really fast. I was kind of surprised by this. The harpsichord has a clear, crystalline, chiming sound, part of which is Romaniuk's evenness and attack. He's got a really nice, even kind of scale. He's got even scales. I'm pretty impressed by that, too. It's impressive that he can play all these keyboard instruments with such sensitivity to their sound worlds. The work unfolds in various sections, and Romaniuk uses different sounds, judging by the album cover. He's got like a one-layered keyboard on the album cover, and I'm guessing that's the instrument he's playing here. And he's probably got a stop on it so he can adjust the volume from like one string to two strings or something like that to make it louder. I always played a harpsichord. It's the only one I never played one of those two manual ones. Like one is two strings and one is one string. So one is quiet and one's loud. The other one's the one you can change the volume on it. There's this little, it has a name. I don't know what it is, but this kind of this wood block in the instrument. If you pull it out, it's kind of like on an organ where it changes the sound. And I think it moves the whole action over so that it's plucking two strings instead of one. I'm guessing he's got something like that here. Let's see. At 3:31, 3 minutes 31 seconds, we hear perpetual motion fugue spoken of above. So if you want to skip right to the fugue, that's where to go. And it's really fast. Fugues are hard to play. I have to say, he's got quite a technique, this guy. Impressive performance as we're showered with harpsichord tones. You ever imagine, like, if you're in the shower, like instead of water coming out of the shower head, chiming harpsichord tones came out? I don't know. Would that cleanse you in some way? I don't know. I'm just kind of fantasizing.
Might be good for my scalp. I don't know.
Yeah. Good for my ears, maybe. Anyway, Philip Glass. We mentioned him at the beginning, track 13. Etude number 2. And this is played on the piano. Now, the only other time I've ever heard this piece is when our good, well, he's not our friend, but he's a pianist we really like, Viklicky Olofsson played this on his Philip Glass album, which came out long before we started this podcast. Anyway, the constant motion of the ostinato, of course, in Philip Glass brings a sense of calm. And this is true of a lot of Glass's music. It's a jolt as we hear the piano timbre again in this arpeggiated work with tricky changing time signatures, often a Philip Glass hallmark. He takes this slowly, because I've heard this played fairly quickly, with light pedal for that cloud it creates between attacks and to sustain the sparse bass notes. There are a lot of they're almost like pedal organ notes, and he has to sort of sustain them, so he hits them pretty hard and holds them. The sound fills out more as the piece goes on, and Romaniuk uses a heavier touch for the chords heard from the third minute on. So this kind of gains in volume as it goes. Track 14, Robert Schumann, Fassungsschwag aus Wien. This is number 4. It's a multi-movement work. This is the intermezzo. And this is played on the forte piano. Again, appropriate. Well, maybe not. Schumann, the Erard piano had been invented. That's still a light-sounding piano, but I guess that would be considered a forte piano these days. Anyway, there's a darkening of sound on this. The instrument blunts the drama of the piece a bit. Romaniuk accentuates the perpetual motion again, as in the Schubert impromptu above, and loses the emotiveness of the piece by doing so. He plays these very straight. There's no rubato. There's no real expressive qualities given to the melody. And this is, I don't want to say that this is Romaniuk's style, but it's the style he's using on this album. And I have to say, I'd rather hear those expressive qualities, but he wants to keep these pieces going, accentuating their perpetuum mobile quality, I suspect. Track 15, one of my favorites of all time, Maurice Ravel, the prelude from Le Tombeau de Couperin. Now, I love all of the Tombeau de Couperin pieces. This is the first one. It's interesting to hear this piece with its variety of texture in this album, but it is an uninterrupted piece. Now, Romaniuk gets a nice ring to the treble in this piece. His articulation is always discernible, especially in the descending figure. The tempo is a bit on the slow side, the measured side. It's a good performance, fitting in with the program well, but it comes across as a bit too carefully played. Some of the sparkling magic of this piece is missing in this performance, but it is nice. Track 16, an anonymous work, Upon la Mire. This is played on the virginal again, the Mussolar virginal. It's a modern-sounding work from the 16th century. The virginal here actually sounds rather heavy. It's probably more closely recorded than it was when we heard it earlier. The piece has a repeating bass line with filigree work at the top, which sounds a bit too mechanical to my ear. But again, that's probably the point. Track 17, Dmitri Shostakovich, Prelude in A minor, number 2, Opus 87. We heard this before when Igor Levit played it on that album with with the Shostakovich Preludes and Fugues, which he coupled with that unbearable piece whose composer I don't remember anymore. Jeez. Anyway, yeah, the homage to Shostakovich. Right. I can't remember the composer now. Anyway, just as well, maybe. A blur of downward arpeggios and obscure harmonies in this. Flurries of arpeggios are heard in this high-speed piece. There's very little pedal used. making the technique even more impressive. Romaniuk plays this as layers of waves that break off and start again at the end point. It kind of reminded me of a wave machine. You ever have one of those wave machines that goes back and forth? It's like a musical version of that. Track 18, an improvisation upon La Mire is the name of this. This is played on the Yamaha, which is an interesting choice again. Romaniuk found the bass line of Upon La Mire too inviting to pass up the opportunity to improvise on. He does that here. The improv that Romaniuk comes up with has a popular type of jazzy feel to it.
I thought so.
Yeah. Track 19, a piece that a lot of us piano students played. Beethoven, Piano Sonata number 17, Opus 31 number 2, the finale, the Perpetuum mobile finale to the Tempest Sonata. This one often gets isolated by piano teachers for their students to play because it just kind of, once it starts, it just keeps going. It kind of drives me crazy when people play one movement of a multi-movement work. It's something that I've kind of bridled against. I figure, there's all this contrast in the three movements. You want to hear all of that. That's part of the piece. But lots of piano students, as I said, play this movement, so I'm used to hearing just this. This is the Tempest Sonata's final movement. Romaniuk emphasizes the perpetual motion of the piece and doesn't really make the material ebb and flow, as do many piano students. They don't really make it ebb and flow either, but professional pianists do. The matte sound that the forte piano, which is what we're hearing here, brings made me hear this familiar movement with new ears, but here I'm afraid Romaniuk isn't the most expressive of pianists, at least not on this album. He could probably play it a different way if he wanted to, but again, he's emphasizing the Perpetuum mobile quality. There's a lot of expression in this movement that goes by the wayside so that we'll focus on the constant waves of arpeggio-driven motion. Eric Satie, Pièce Squad number 3. That's the Travers 3. This is on the piano this time, which is the way we usually hear it. It was a good idea to disperse these three pieces throughout the album, as I said, and to play them on different instruments, because as we realize now, all three of them are kind of similar sounding. They really don't sound that much different from each other, really. The piece comes across in the amiable way the other two do, and they're very unassuming works. All right, and then the grand finale, track 21, Johann Hieronymus Kapsberger, with an arrangement by Romaniuk himself, Toccata Arpeggiata. And this one uses the Prophet Rev 2 synthesizer to generate the arpeggios. Now, those of us who grew up in the 80s are very familiar with this instrument from popular music. I think this is the first time since the 80s that I've even heard it. So what he does is he generates the arpeggio patterns. It kind of sounds like a waveform on a screen that's been kind of converted into sound, really. And then he sort of plays the piano on top of that. So we hear the synth arpeggios right away. They sound like they're from another world than the rest of the album. Again, probably plugged directly into the mixing console. There was a real presence in the room of this instrument. The piano is played in its treble range only, and the sound is bright and sounds close. The sound of the Prophet synth put me right back in the 1980s. Right there with Cyndi Lauper having fun. Anyway, it was an interesting experiment to end the album with. It was fun. Okay. I think if you're going to listen to this album, you don't want to approach it as a snob. You want to kind of approach it as, you don't want to be a discerning classical listener for this. You want to lay back and enjoy it and just kind of let the different sounds just sort of interest you. I liked listening to this, to be honest. The various keyboard instruments used made the constant perpetual motion of the pieces more listenable. If this was all one instrument playing music like this, it would have driven me crazy. But I liked his approach here. Romaniuk has a remarkable sensitivity for the attack and sound words of all of these instruments. And when I say the attack, I mean there are different techniques required to play the older instruments. The piano and the harpsichord are not the same technique. And that is no small talent. This guy's got a lot of it. He doesn't really do keyboard magic, at least not on this album. Several of these pieces, especially the romantic ones, provide opportunities for that. But he just kind of focuses on the perpetual motion. So he's not really very expressive on this album. The Bach works and the Baroque works don't really require too much of that, nor does the Ligeti or Glass or things like that. It's a real hodgepodge of piano works from different points in musical history. So that was interesting too, to have all of this music history together on one album. This could be an enjoyable discovery for fans of the keyboard. I would recommend this. And if you like this, you'd want to go back and hear his earlier album, Bells. which is also pretty interesting.
Yeah, I thought this was a good adult music choice. Just as we often form our own episode themes, here's a collection of works around a theme, motion. But you need to, as I mentioned at the beginning, you need the notes and your full attention to appreciate what's happening here in terms of approach, interpretation.
Or you just need us telling you what's happening. Now that you've heard this, you can go listen to it and you'll be more informed.
And instrument choice. Actually, as the notes are laid out, you've got to be looking around on different pages to pull all the information together. But anyway, don't just throw this on the playlist while you fold the laundry or something, or you'll miss out on what's going on. I found it engaging, a bit daring, and sometimes defying of expectation, but the end result is to make you re-examine the music from very old works to modern by hearing them all in a new way, and it was very interesting. So I liked the whole approach and concept that he put together here.
Yeah, you had mentioned ironing earlier. I don't think this music kind of stays in the background. I feel like if you're ironing, you're not really paying attention, right? You're just kind of letting it.
Exactly.
This is sounds that'll grab your attention, basically, and take you away from what you're doing. All right, so we took forever to talk about that, but I think it was worth it. Anyway, next we have another rather unusual program. This is on the Hyperion label, which means you're not going to be able to sample. You're only going to be able to sample this from the Hyperion site. You can't hear the entire tracks. Unless you come to my house, if you happen to be in Japan, send us an email. Maybe I'll invite you over if I find you respectable enough. Anyway, I don't know who listens to us. What's that Groucho Marx joke? I wouldn't belong to a club that would have someone like me as a member. Yeah, I wouldn't invite anybody to my house that's anything like me, is basically what it comes down to. Anyway, this is Harpsichord Concertos by Bohuslav Martinů, Hans Krása, and I got to get the guy's name. Victor Kalabis, played by Mahan Esfahani, a harpsichordist who we're rather a fan of ever since he put out his album of C.P.E. Bach harpsichord concertos on Hyperion many, many years ago. This is he's accompanied by the Prague Radio Symphony Orchestra, conducted by Alexander Liebreich. And as I said, this is on the Hyperion label, one of my favorite labels, perhaps my favorite label, because so many of my favorite pianists are on it, but one that for some reason won't put their music on streaming. I have to buy all of these CDs, and I'm happy to do so, but my listeners can't just listen to the piece. Anyway, we have 3 Czech composers on this, all from the 20th century, and they're all composing for the harpsichord. You might wonder why that would be. Well, the reason is different for all of them. Esfahani himself wrote the booklet notes, and he doesn't mention why they did, but he kind of does in Martinú's piece, and I'm going to try to tease that reason out here. You know, I asked some questions about this. Were they commissions? Was the timbre of the harpsichord something people were interested in at the time? And there was also a Poulenc's Concert Champêtre, which also used the harpsichord. It was a harpsichord concerto. Esfahani acknowledges that many think of the instrument as an outsider. I think that's we kind of think of it now as like something for Baroque music, but as something that was going to come back in to be part of like a modern composition. Yeah, I think that's true, and there's a good reason for it too, because orchestras got a lot bigger and louder, and the harpsichord is not a loud instrument. And I'm gonna kind of give my talk about this away at the beginning. That's gonna be a bit of a problem on this album as far as like orchestral balance goes.
Yeah, especially on this Martinů, because what surprised me, well, lots of things surprised me about it too, but with the piano in there with the harpsichord a lot too,
That was odd, but the fact that the harpsichord is much quieter is actually going to work to this piece's advantage, and I'll explain why when I get there, even though it's kind of odd sounding. Esfahani acknowledges that they think of the instrument as an outsider, but I would like to think this would be the case then, that it is an outsider at this time. Anyway, we have 3 fascinating works here from the past. 2 are from the 1930s and one's from 1975, the Kalabis one. So, 20th century harpsichord works. I'd like to know more about the genre, and we'll learn a bit by listening. Now, Bohuslav Martinů, a composer who I really like. This is his Concerto for Harpsichord and Small Orchestra, composed in 1935. Martinů himself was an outsider. Now, Esfahani had mentioned that the harpsichord itself was kind of seen as an outsider. So Martinů, he was a polytonalist among the conservatives and a tonalist among the avant-garde. So you want to think of Einstein. He kind of said something about like if he discovered relativity, he's Swiss, but the Germans will call him German. The Swiss will consider him to be Swiss. But if his theory had failed, he said the Swiss would call him German, and the Germans would call him Jewish. That's an Einstein quote. That's not me. Anyway, so Martinů, he didn't fit in. Basically, he was his own man, and that's a great thing now. But at the time, when you're trying to make your career, that becomes a really hard thing. The harpsichord, being an outsider instrument at the time, might have attracted him, and that could be the reason. In his music, he tried to reinvent music from within structures whose resemblance to old forms does not hide his instinctive approach to deconstructing tonality. So in other words, what that means is he would use like older structures, but he wouldn't write in the harmony that those structures would make you think that you're familiar with in those structures. And in this case, the structure he's using is a concerto grosso, which is from the 18th century. This is Baroque style. And that's probably why he chose the harpsichord, or why he used the concerto grosso in this case, because he's writing it for a harpsichord. Now, if you think about what a concerto grosso does, you have the full orchestra playing, and then you'll have a solo instrument, and everything else will quiet around it. And then when the concerto grosso comes back in, it'll always play the same theme, and it'll be a lot louder than the solo instruments. That happens here, too, except that it's really exaggerated. And I don't really know that it works so well, but we'll talk about that. The drive to reinvent music within the structure produces a startling range of emotional states, according to Esfahani's notes, and a sense of irony. I could hear that. Mm-hmm. Irony was a big thing in the 20th century music. Think of Mahler. He uses irony a lot. And finally etched characterizations that all amount to wit. I guess it's the concerto grosso influence that led him to consider the harpsichord here. First movement, Poco Allegro. This starts out with a really odd folk-like sound. And when I say folk-like, I mean Central European folk music. The harpsichord is clearly boosted in the sound. It's a lot louder than you would think. I can't even imagine what this would sound like live. The orchestra would have to really be on its toes to, not cover the harpsichord completely. That said, the orchestra is pretty loud comparatively, even so, in this situation. So you do get a sense of the discrepancy between the power of the orchestra and the very quiet sound of the harpsichord. The harpsichord also has like a thin tone to it, and it doesn't match the body of the orchestral sound gets. So there's really extreme contrast in this. But again, we're in that concerto grosso sort of element, so it's acceptable here. You understand why it's like that. Theme 2 is more gentle and romantic. It starts at about the 1 minute 30-second mark. It's a total change from the active opening. You'll notice it when you hear it. And Martinú's whole concerto grosso approach is audible here once you're aware of it. So if you don't know what a concerto grosso is, go and listen to one of the Brandenburg concertos, or maybe one of the Handel concerto grossos, or the Corelli ones, and you'll sort of get the idea. Or Vivaldi, for all that matter. The orchestra bursts in like a tutti, while the harpsichord acts as the solo instrument. Well, it is. The orchestra, by the way, includes a piano, as Russ said, and we really rarely hear the piano and harpsichord together. It's odd. I think it's kind of like hearing like a car and a spaceship, or maybe, I don't know.
Strange.
They just don't seem to go together here, but again, it's really quirky. The harpsichord gets a lot of space in the second and third minutes to play by himself, so the volume between full orchestra and solo harpsichord is heavily marked, and around the 4 minute mark you can hear a Baroque-like concerto grosso theme. The orchestra propels the rhythm forward, but the harpsichord sort of breaks it up when it comes in. Second movement, Adagio, starts with the solo harpsichord playing an unwinding theme. The orchestra sounds thick when it comes in, despite being pared down to a flute melody and strings. There's a piano, too, playing a repeating downward figure. Again, the concerto grosso format is discernible, with the orchestra picking up on what the harpsichord plays and repeating elements of it. And I should mention that Esfahani does a lot to make the harpsichord's part interesting, as he would. He's a very creative player, which is one of the reasons that we both really like him. He kind of delves into the music and tries to shape it in rather interesting ways. The third movement, Allegretto, has a motor rhythm, so here we are back in the previous Romaniuk recording in a way. As in a Baroque concerto, they often had those motor rhythms in the third movements, but there's nothing Baroque about the themes in this particular movement. The piano has a large part to play in the thematic material. The piano, that is, not the harpsichord, okay? We hear the harpsichord at about a minute and 10 seconds in, playing the same rhythm, and it's very busy in its figuration. And this is something that's going to come out on this recording. Esfahani, he's playing at a high speed, and he has a lot of stamina as a player because he's able to, he's constantly playing in some of these pieces, and he doesn't slacken at all. It's pretty amazing. I feel like he's pushing the tempo a bit in this particular movement. It sounds like he's playing with everything he's worth while the orchestra effortlessly keeps up its material. Yeah. So he's got to really struggle to keep up with them, I guess. It doesn't sound like he's struggling, though. I don't want to make it sound like there's that. But there is tension between the harpsichord and the orchestra. He stands out throughout the work, but he's especially noteworthy in this movement. The orchestra is loud. When I say that, he stands out throughout the three movements. The orchestra is loud throughout the work, and the basses come across as exceptionally rich. Esfahani stays busy for the majority of the 6 minutes and 34 seconds of the movement, and he's very impressive, as he will be throughout this program. Now, I'm actually a very big fan of Martinú's music, but this wasn't really one of my favorite works of his, although I guess maybe I'll like it more if I listen to it a few more times. I found it rather odd and not in a really revelatory way, but I don't know. Maybe it'll grow on me. The fourth and fifth tracks are work by Hans Krása, Kammermusik for harpsichord and 7 instruments from 1936. Now, Krása was one of the more successful composers of his era. And then 1942 came. He was brought to Theresienstadt, which was a forced labor camp established by the Nazi SS, which nevertheless had a rich cultural life due to the number of talented inmates there. But it was really a holding kind of place for Auschwitz, and that's where Krása was sent and executed in 1944. So one of the great talents of his era, really, of his period, and his life was ended early. The Kammermusik was written in 1936 when Krása was at the height of his public reputation. He was Czech Jewish, basically. Okay, the first movement, Bewegt, has an interesting opening with a thick-sounding cello line playing, answered by the thinner-sounding harpsichord. The cello has a big role in the opening of the movement. Winds are also prominent, playing in harmony, then contrapuntally when the cello's theme winds out. It is, after all, a chamber symphony or a chamber music work. At 1 minute and 57 seconds, there's an interesting brass and harpsichord juxtaposition that makes the harpsichord's trill sound like some kind of an alarm or a phone ringing. It caught my attention. A more Central European folk-like theme is heard at about the 2 minute and 20 second mark. Then we get bubbling wind sound accompanying afterwards. Again, the recording produces a rich bass sound, especially when the bass bow low in their range. And that's great to hear, except that it really contrasts heavily with the harpsichord. So I'm not really sure about the balance here. The orchestra at the 4 minute mark is recorded really close, the bassoon blaring through. It's enjoyable for its presence. Again, I'm not sure about the overall balance. The orchestra perhaps could have been more distant, but then the harpsichord would be inaudible because he'd be distant too. The harpsichord plays an ostinato figure as the orchestra comment in the 5th minute, bass notes bursting out of the texture. I really love the harsh last chord of the movement, played by high brass. It's ear-splitting in a satisfying way. Does that make sense to you? Ear-splitting in a satisfying way? Well, if you love music, it would. I remember playing a Bartók piece, and there was this really harsh chord. I had a friend run into the room really excited, saying, "What is that?" You just like the harsh sound. Anyway, the second movement and the last movement, Sehr ruhig. This movement is based on a rather popular song that Krása had written some years before for a play. It's extremely romantic in the theme, and to be honest, I thought it was a bit syrupy. There's a bit of the jazz ballad.
Yeah, jazz influenced in the harmonies here.
It's got a jazz ballad orchestration in the strings, a 1930s jazz ballad. I think Misty, I guess, or something like that. At 1 minute and 11 seconds, the material turns more popular in a Central European way. At 1 minute and 32 seconds, we finally hear the harpsichord playing a repeating chord as the cello plays a theme over it. The harpsichord also adds right-hand thematic material himself, and I love the reedy bassoon sound at the 2 minute and 10 second mark. All right, basically this movement seems to proceed as various scenes started by the orchestra and then commented on by the harpsichord. Droning basses accompany a foreboding harpsichord theme at the 4-minute mark, and the piece ends rather sullenly with a low flute melody punctuated by pizzicato bass. The last work, and the longest one on the album, is by Victor Kalabis, Concerto for Harpsichord and String Orchestra, Opus 42, written in 1975. Now, this work is really personal to Esfahani because he was the last student of Victor Kalabis's wife. So this is sort of a work that's, I guess, close to his heart. It probably brings him back to those times. The piece was also dedicated to her by Kalabis himself. Anyway, the first movement, Allegro Leggero, starts with a ticking set of chords on creaky high strings. This really does set an interesting sound right at the beginning. It kind of draws you in. They're matching the harpsichord's timbre, the strings are. Notice the harpsichord's subtle entry almost. It's really good writing. I really enjoyed the opening for this work. I like the way in general the string orchestra's timbre matches the harpsichords. It's all got a silvery quality to it, and silvery is probably a good way to describe this whole movement's timbre. Remember, it's a string orchestra. The harpsichord engages in a lot of circling figuration, and his part is pretty busy. Once he comes in, he's constantly playing. And again, this is a very impressive performance by Esfahani. At the 2-minute and 20-second marks, he ends his long section with trills. Leaping appoggiatura figures follow in the harpsichord. Sprays of arpeggiated material are heard, or is heard, at the 3-minute and 40-second mark in the harpsichord, with emphatic 2-note statements from the orchestra. This changes to melting, silvery, descending string lines over the busy harpsichord. Esfahani being put through his paces, technically, as the soloist here, even though he's not always in the spotlight. While the orchestra's playing, listen to what he's doing. It's really amazing, really. He's constantly being made to work, let's say. The piece sounds like it takes a lot of stamina. At 5 minutes and 30 seconds, there's a cadenza, and the harpsichord indulges in this silvery tone, with a lot of unharmonized notes ringing out softly. This harpsichord seems to get quite a bit of sustain compared to others I've heard. Maybe it's because it's just recorded really closely. Listen to the 5-minute 30-second to 6-minute 30-second mark to the cadenza, and I imagine this must be recorded very close. Then we hear chords, and they're not as loud. Is this production trickery? Anyway, the movement ends on a sustained chord. Second movement, Andante. Again, this has a silver color. This is the color I associate with this whole piece. So there's a silvery toned viola, I'm guessing that's a viola, starts this out with a rather romantic pleading melody, and shimmering strings answer it. It's actually quite lovely and appealing. The harpsichord enters in the 2nd minute with chords, which the high violins harmonize over. There's a contrapuntal cello melody. It's got a really odd enchanting harmony from the harpsichord after the 3-minute 30-second mark. The harpsichord gets a quiet chiming sound after 3 minutes and 50 seconds. It has broken up chords. There's some loud, powerful interjections from the orchestra. Basically, the harpsichord plays slow solo material, and the orchestra occasionally adds harmonic color. Oddly, by the end, the harpsichord and the strings change places, where the harpsichord is banging out chords and a solo violin plays sweetly in the high end. Listen from 7 minutes on for that. Now, I want to mention, this is a very inventive piece so far, and the third movement will continue that. This starts Allegro Vivo. It's got a rushing string theme, and it's syncopated. The harpsichord comes in almost immediately with busy figuration. It really takes over for a while, with a machine-like repeating patterns. At the 2-minute 40-second mark, the harpsichord slows down for some more emphatically stated material, which the strings respond to with brooding legato lines. This entire section broods, very different from the opening Allegro Vivo. It goes all the way to the 6th minute, where we hear crashing chords on the harpsichord and quiet high fragments on the violins. By the 7th minute, the speed picks up again, with the harpsichord's line slowly morphing into a fast trill, while the strings play a Central European type of traditional dance. The rhythm breaks up in the 9th minute, and the material sounds more fragmentary. By the 10th minute, the harpsichord is tolling out chords, while the strings play fragmentary phrases. Chiming appoggiaturas in the harpsichord end the piece, along with a sustained high violin tone. Very inventive piece, and probably the highlight of the album, I would say. It's really different. It sounds really unique to me. So the sound quality of this album is very good, but I'm not sure about the balance. what I mean by the sound quality is good, it's very clear. But the balance is kind of odd. I guess it would be, given that the harpsichord is a solo instrument with varying bodies of string orchestras or full orchestras. It could be a result of the score, but I feel like the producer and engineer placed the orchestra too close in order to make the harpsichord audible. It creates extreme contrast, and the orchestral detail is almost intimately heard, but I'm not sure. Still, the sound we're hearing is clearly produced the way the producer wanted it to sound, so you'll have to judge for yourself. There's no really problem with the recording. I think the producer wanted it to sound like this, but I don't know that this is going to please everybody as far as sound balance goes. Getting the volume set right was a challenge. I had this turned up loud so I could get the detail, but that occasionally led to the mass orchestra blasting out of the speakers. Esfahani, like in that Maxell kind of ad where you had the speaker kind of blowing the guy's clothes back, right? Esfahani himself is quite the virtuosic player. I've heard him play technically challenging works before, but here he's in the spotlight for a long time, and he's got stamina as well as technique. That I didn't know, so I'm hearing that for the first time here. The entire program is interesting and worth a listen, especially the unknown to me Kalabis work that ends the program. I like the silvery quality of the orchestration and harpsichord and the rather unique emotional areas this work delves into. And I'm wondering if there are any separate tracks or mics for the harpsichord and orchestra in that piece. Anyway, you're in for quite an enjoyable adventure with this album, I would say. It's an adventure it is. It's not really straightforward music, and I think you should go on that adventure. Think of yourself as Indiana Jones and go into this piece and discover these new things for us, I guess.
Yeah, it was an unusual sort of journey with the harpsichord. We defied expectations in the first recording with the choice of instruments, and the way the harpsichord is used in all of these pieces is really unusual and interesting. I'm going to go the other way. The Martinů is my favorite here.
Oh, interesting. I have to hear it again, really, is what it comes down to.
I enjoyed the oddity of the sort of earlier era form and interesting use of the harpsichord, and then with the piano, which I wasn't expecting at all. And but I enjoyed the pieces. The Krása was, kind of unique too in the instrumentation with this kind of small ensemble, and then that it got jazzy. I wasn't really ready for that. I'll have to listen to the Kalabis. I got kind of worn out by the end of it.
Understandable. See, I heard this one separately from the other two.
Okay.
I did them in 2 nights, so I went to this one fresh. Yeah.
It's really dense, and the harmonies were a little bit tough to chew on.
Well, they were, but the timbre was interesting, and they were just odd combinations.
Yeah.
Like I was really interested in his whole sound world.
It's all very unique, though. But you maybe want to, it probably would be best to break up the middle piece. The Krása is just a 2 movements, so it's shorter. The other ones, though, you might want to section off and listen to independently.
Yeah, the Kalabis, the ending piece, is as long as the first 2 together, really. Right. It's a half an hour piece, so it's pretty involved.
Yeah, but something I didn't know, with these modern works of harpsichord, all coming from Czech Republic, I guess, former Czechoslovakia, and we're going to hear some Czech in jazz later this evening, so hang on for that. And next week, more Czech too. So,
next week too.
Put lots of Czechs on the list.
Okay, yeah. All right. Are we going to call that podcast "Check It Out" with the season? Because it's such an obvious joke, and we just have to
with
do
this
it.
Title somehow.
We've already angered the French with our fanciful French music titles. Now we'll have to do that to the Czech Republic too. Now, anyway,
watch the downloads soar. The outrage.
Well, that's if outrage is going to get us downloads, I'm all for it. That's all I'm going to try.
Something,
Something's got to do it. Anyway, our third classical work is by a composer that we talked about last year, and this is another in that series, Nikolai Kapustin. Piano Concerto Number 5, Concerto Opus 104, and Sinfonietta Opus 49 by the pianist Frank Dupree. I think he's German. And the Rundfunk-Sinfonieorchester Berlin, conducted by Dominik Beykirch on the concerto anyway. Now, Kapustin, he's born in what is modern-day Ukraine. It was Ukraine when he was born, too. But he spent most of his time in Russia. Now, this is the Soviet era, so when Ukraine and Russia were really sort of the same place. They were the Soviet Union. So he studied in Moscow, and he spent most of his life in Russia. And he's really famous for writing jazzy pieces in a real jazz idiom. He's often referred to as the Russian, or I guess the Ukrainian, Gershwin. But, and sometimes he does kind of sound like that.
Yeah.
He's really appealing, but his melodies aren't as memorable, say, as Gershwin's. Gershwin had that real gift for melody. But nevertheless, it's really interesting. Now, what he really did is he was very aware of jazz music, and he was also familiar with symphonic or classical form, and he tried to meld the two, which I guess Gershwin was starting to do, but he died pretty young. And Kapustin really does that. Anyway, this is on the Capriccio label, and this is an ongoing series.
I read an interesting quote from him because he did play in jazz ensembles.
Kapustin or Dupree?
Yeah,
which one?
Kapustin.
Okay.
So he regarded himself as a composer rather than a jazz musician.
Right.
And this is his quote. "I was never a jazz musician. I never tried to be a real jazz pianist, but I had to do it because of the composing. I'm not interested in improvisation. And what is a jazz musician without improvisation? All my improvisations are written, of course, and they became much better. It improved them." So I thought that was kind of interesting insight into what you will hear on his.
Yeah, and that does kind of sum up what you hear. Now, here's the thing. Music like this is going to sound better if it sounds improvised. And not all classical musicians can do that. But Dupree can. He's almost the ideal sort of interpreter of this music. I've never heard anybody play this well, except for maybe Stephen Osborne, but he never played the concertos. He played a lot of solo piano pieces. Marc-André Hamelin played these as well. Or not these, but he's played Kapustin's music as well. But I don't feel like he got the jazz idiom as well as Dupree does. Anyway, let's talk about Kapustin a little bit. He spent his youth in the dictatorial grip of Stalin's USSR, found himself in Moscow at the beginning of the 21st century, and remained faithful to himself throughout the decades. And I think he died in 2020. Oh, he just died 2 years ago. Most of his works are stylistically related to jazz and skillfully combine its elements with the classical music tradition from Bach to Prokofiev and Stravinsky. And in fact, we're going to hear a lot of Prokofiev and Stravinsky, especially in these works on this album.
One thing, though, I think you might need like your little Pez dispenser of Ritalin to get through these works, because, man, things change really quickly.
They do,
in these pieces. The tempo change-ups and...
Please, the YouTube generation will just eat this up. Come on, it's perfect for you.
Yeah, it's perfect, yeah.
Yeah, it's really perfect for our times, or even maybe for younger people than us. I mean, it kind of kept my heart beating, let's just say that.
For sure.
Maybe you'll want to play this if I'm on my deathbed. It'll give me another few years or something. Anyway, he composed 6 piano concertos. We heard the 4th last year, and we're going to hear the 5th now. Now, the 4th was a really jazzy work, but the 5th is not. Okay, so it's a little different. It does have jazzy elements in it, though. By the way, Frank Dupree, the pianist on this recording, was trained as a drummer.
Okay.
But devoted himself fully... Yeah, it does make sense. He devoted himself fully to the wide range of the classical piano repertoire at the same time. People with this kind of talent, I tell you, man, I would have been happy just to play the piano. He has a special enthusiasm for the music of the 20th century, and it shows here. He gets the idioms, the jazz idiom, the Prokofiev, machine rhythm idiom, and Stravinsky's kind of like, rhythms exceptionally well. And the drumming, I could see, probably helped him a lot. Anyway, let's talk about this concerto, number 5. Very different from number 4, which was really very jazzy. This one kind of was more like Prokofiev to me, or had more of that in it. It's a 20-minute single movement, but it has separate sections, so it can be heard as a 4-movement work. The jazz elements are heard in the first time in the orchestra briefly at the 19-second mark. There's a thundering bass octave on the piano at the 39-second mark when he enters. That's a great entry. There's a drum kit in the orchestra too, giving the work its jazzy rhythm. When the drums aren't playing, the piano plays more in classical mode with figuration and rapid arpeggiation. Judging from the lively first theme, the piece is going to switch between jazzy rhythms, classical speed, and popular tune-type melodies. So it's like a multi-hybrid work. It's nice in a way, because one of the things I loved about... I shouldn't talk about early postmodernism. Now we think about postmodernism, we think of all the horrible things that are happening now. But early postmodernism in the arts just kind of combined these things that really didn't belong together and put them together. And we accepted it because of the world that we lived in at the time. And I think that's what's happening here. We're just so used to things like colliding with each other, and all of these this hybrid work works really well. There's a quiet section starting in the second minute whose figuration and string accompaniment remind me of the early 20th century, particularly of the strings in Stravinsky's Firebird at certain points of that score. If you think of the Stravinsky Firebird, the Chorovod, right before that, there's this beautiful string line. And this section here reminds me of that. At 3 minutes and 38 seconds, there's a Gershwin-like piano theme, accompanied by a drum kit, but it gives way quickly to cascading classical figuration. The material changes quickly, perhaps revealing the constant distractions of life in 1993, when the piece was written, or the 20th century in general. The orchestration of this piece is really interesting, with a lot more timbral coloring than you'd expect, though not quite as much of the excess of the early 20th century. At the 6 minute and 40-second mark, we change sections to a lento tempo, so this is like a new movement. The material has a light jazz lilt peeking through the classical sounding lines. You almost want this to decide whether it's a classical or jazz piece, but that's us with our modern separation of the genres wanting that. Kapustin saying this all belongs together, and it certainly goes together in his head and in this work. Yeah, why should the two genres be separated? They would seem to be very different. This is composed, by the way, Kapustin, another thing Kapustin said about his music, you won't hear a note of improvisation in it. Everything is written down.
Yeah.
So it can't be considered jazz, but he uses the jazz sound in his composing. Kapustin really is the ideal adult music podcast composer. Just so we have the ideal album for the first album. Now we have the ideal composer because he's combining the two worlds. He's got classical and jazz. That's what we're doing.
Yep.
We are the podcasting Kapustins. At the 10 minute and 12-second mark, there's a start to a new section, the Allegretto, and this is played with a drum kit and has a funky groove to it, if you can believe it.
Yeah, it does. That's what
funky,
I wrote too. Yeah.
Funky classical orchestral music. Oh boy, well, it's possible because he does it here. Yeah, that kind of surprised me. It was like a nice surprise too. The orchestration is interesting here too, with the very unfunky flutes punctuating the material along with the other wind instruments. Piano lines twinkle in the high end in the 12th minute, then get into some syncopated jazzy lines. There's a dramatic fortissimo passage toward the end of the 13th minute that gives way to shuddering strings that quieten and make room for the piano cadenza halfway through the 14th minute. This is highly classical in its rapid figuration and work with climbing chords. At the 15-minute, 30-second mark, I hear Prokofiev's mechanical rhythm in the piano playing. Then the 16-minute mark, we suddenly snap into a rapid swinging rhythm in the right-hand line. At the 17-minute, 30-second mark, the piano playing turns to a decidedly late 19th to early 20th century romantic style. At around 18 minutes and 20 seconds, we're back to the jazzy rhythm. It breaks up, and there's so many varying elements of the past in this part of the cadenza that it conjures up many different memories of music listening for me. It's almost like I'm dying and I'm hearing all the music I heard before my last breath, all passing before my ears at the same time. That's kind of what I thought about. The piece goes into a full-on approach to the end with 1930s Hollywood grandeur with one final piece of piano figuration before reaching the final chord. What I would say about this piece is that what's that thing that Elon Musk wants to give you, that brain implant? What is that thing called?
I don't know.
Ah, man, I can't remember the name of it now. You don't need that if you listen to this piece. At least you don't need any music element to it. I can't remember that thing he wants implanted in people's heads. Anyway. Tracks 2 through 4, Concerto for 2 pianos and percussion. Now, there's, of course, a famous Bartók work for 2 pianos and percussion, but this is much different than that. The players on this are Adrian Brendle on piano. Please, no relation to the Alfred Brendle, the famous English pianist. This is a German pianist, and he spells his name L-E at the end and not E-L. Meinhard Obi Gene on the drum set, and Franz Bach on percussion. This first movement is rather odd. The pianos are playing jazzy lines, but the percussion are playing in contrasting rhythm. They occasionally snap into the same rhythm, but then go off in their same direction again. The percussion eventually disappears, leaving space for the two pianos to play together. The material livens up at the 2-minute and 20-second mark with the return of the percussion. The pianos, one playing a swing-like rhythm and the other syncopated chords, sound really dense. There's really a lot going on rhythmically at the same time in this movement. And sort of like in a Bach fugue, you sort of have to take a back seat in your head to follow them all, or just let the whole thing hit you as it's played. At 5 minutes and 20 seconds, a new section starts with a little hiccup in the rhythm. The rhythm suddenly straightens out at around 5 minutes and 45 seconds. A quiet, wandering section of the pianos is heard at the 7-minute mark, and the piece gets into a jazzy rhythm and ends suddenly and unexpectedly on an unresolved harmony. The second movement, Largo. The pianos here play a meditative, hazy, nighttime melody as the drums accompany with brushes. The melody has a 1930s or 40s American popular song feel to it, so that would be kind of in a jazz vein, like the popular music of that time. By the 1 minute and 50-second mark, one piano is playing a theme while the other decorates with rapid figuration. At the 2 minute and 10-second mark, it's off to the races with dazzlingly fast scales by the one piano, while the other plays bass and chords. The drum set sets a rapid rhythm on the ride cymbal, and we slow down at 3 minutes and 50 seconds for a lighter section. The music lightens up to the end with hypnotic swirling lines by the 5th minute. Third movement, Allegro impetuoso. There's a loud, stunning attack on the piano chords for the opening, followed by intricate rhythmic material that changes after brief sections. I'm hearing some jazz influence here and a lot of Prokofiev mechanicism in this movement. The sudden quieting at 2 minutes and 51 seconds is just one of the amazing sudden changes in mood we hear throughout this piece and album. It's brief. By the 3rd minute, we're back to the rapid figuration. There's a pretty metallic percussion section at about the 3 minute and 45-second mark. Syncopated driving jazz rhythm in the 4th minute brings in the drum kit to accompany for the repeat of the material. The rhythm builds to the end where it ends forte. Okay, the last piece, Sinfonietta for piano 4 hands. And that's all. This was originally an orchestral work, and the arrangement for the piano 4 hands has become popular with piano duos all over the world, and it's heard mostly in that form. Anyway, the other pianist it's Frank Dupree again with Adrian Brendle. There's an overture, the first movement, has a syncopated jazzy feel to the piano's opening chord-based line. There's a lot going on between the 4 hands, but it's all cheerful. Crisp, clear, close sounds on the piano. It comes across fully dimensional on the recording. A second more melodic but equally cheerful theme starts at around 1 minute and 23 seconds. The rhythm is taut and propelled by repeating bass notes. There are a lot of repeated notes in the movement and some pretty impressive virtuosity too. The movement has a combined feel of jazz and Prokofiev in his mechanical rhythm period. Movement 2, slow waltz, larghetto, moves at the speed of a Satie gymnopédie and has a hazier quality to it. That's a famous piano work by Satie. Look it up on your streaming service. You know them. They're famous. The melodic themes are muted and introspective. There's some pretty intriguing harmony in the 3rd minute of the piece, right up to the tolling end in the bass. Third movement, intermezzo, played allegretto, has a syncopated jazzy rhythm to the opening, a highly percussive movement with hammered out repeated notes propelling the rhythm. There's a more melodic theme starting around the 50-second mark, and I can hear why this piece was so appealing in its 4-hand piano guise. But it sounds really difficult to play.
Little Gershwin-y here.
Yeah. Dupree and Brendle seem to pull out all possible detail, though, and again, the rhythm is taut. By the 2-minute mark, we're back in the repeated note bass rhythm, and with brief diversions, this remains till the end. The 4th movement, rondo, is played presto. It has a very fast rhythm with a jazz feel in the upper melody, though the rhythm doesn't swing. Kapustin kind of gives this an old-timey jazzy feel with a rapid bass note chord, kind of stride feel to it in the bass, trading with Kapustin's favored repeated note-generating rhythm. There's a more muted section at 2 minutes and 25 seconds or so, continuing the rhythmic feel. Midway through the 3rd minute, the movement has gained a volume and rhythm, and familiar themes lead to the end, which has rapid, repeated thematic flourishes in the high end of the keyboard. The recording is very clear, captures the piano sound well. Dupree is a virtuosic pianist with a large variety of touches, getting a good feel in all the genres. He's actually a pretty incredible in this repertoire with his virtuosic ability and a very authentic feel for all the styles in Kapustin's music. Kapustin cycles through and manages the quick changes of mood expertly. Whatever you think of Kapustin's music, ingenious integration of musical styles, or simply pastiche, I don't think this is pastiche at all. It's certainly appealing and continues to draw musicians who want to play it, which is a sign that his music is in a healthy state for the future. The world needs music like this now. This is music that could easily draw a younger audience just because it's kind of like YouTube for the concert hall or something like that. It just changes so quickly. Maybe it's like TikTok, because you don't need a long attention span to listen to these works, but they are complex, and you will get I don't want to say an education, because that'll chase people away, but you will get a little challenge out of it, or a thrill.
It's exciting for sure. You've got these classical forms and other influences with mostly jazz elements and stylings, but the rhythmic and mood changes within any movement are many and sudden. So for the short attention span, or get yourself some Ritalin and listen all the way through. Still, despite that kind of quirkiness, the piano parts are virtuosic and impressive in creativity. And Dupree shows that he's got the technique and flair to pull these off with style at a high speed. Yeah, I think it's exciting music. Apparently, there's a lot more of his music out there to be explored. From
a lot of it's on the
Capriccio
label. This is an ongoing series. I think we're going to hear all 6 piano concertos eventually.
And, who knows, too? I mean, I grew up and I was listening to jazz going back historically. So I wanted to know, the music going back. And so growing up in the 80s and going back exploring, swing and bebop, and still filtered through my American music experience. But how did jazz sound to, people in other countries from different eras before all modern media and, free access to all styles of music? So what would jazz sound like to Soviet ears back when it was really hard to listen to this music, and how would you interpret it? Probably completely differently. And
I think it was always freeing, though, people heard it as something, liberating.
So putting that into your structure of music and then creating, something new, even if it's completely written, but inspired by improvised music and music that was composed of different elements from a different place, you're going to get something completely interesting and new. And that's what you get here. So I'm really entertained by listening to these recordings, the previous one we talked about and this one as well.
Yeah, the previous one was more jazzy, though. So if you're interested in the jazz element, you want to go for the previous one, Piano Concerto number 4. There's also, Frank Dupree plays Kapustin's piano trios, and they're all very jazzy. It's almost like a jazz trio, really.
Interesting. All right, and jazz trios and jazziness is a good transition into the jazz program, because we've got a trio of trios tonight, and they're all quite different and from different places, but we're going to end up back in the U.S., but we're going to take a few detours. Well, we'll stay close to start out and go to our northern neighbor of the U.S., Canada. And actually, we'll go to Quebec with our first trio here, and the wonderful pianist, lady pianist here, Lorraine Desmarais. And she's got a new recording out. This is on Analekta record label, Street Beat Suite. How about that? This came out at the end of January. And so, I like to...
Kind of sounds like it's going to be a hip-hop album with that title.
Street Beat Suite.
Yeah.
There's so many great pianists in all these different countries, but we don't get to hear them really recognized enough in U.S. jazz. So I'm always looking for new players. And I've got, 2 tonight that I didn't know much about, including Lorraine Desmarais. But I'm really excited about what I found in these first 2 recordings. Anyway, Desmarais was born in Montreal. She earned a bachelor's of music and also a master of music in classical piano. And then
you can hear that on this album too.
Yeah, I was at the University de Sherbrooke, and then she also studied at McGill University, and later took lessons from Kenny Barron in New York.
Wow,
can't get a better teacher than that.
Right.
And she's also been influenced by Chick Corea and Oscar Peterson, and that's all going to come through in her playing. She's performed with world-renowned jazz artists, including Chick Corea, Oliver Jones, Joe Lovano, and many others. Paquito de Rivera, I should mention, because there's a tune dedicated to him. Kenny Wheeler. And trumpeter Guido Basso used to play with the Rob McConnell Boss Brass Big Band. I got to meet him once when I was up in Toronto at a jazz little festival when I was in university, so that was kind of a highlight. Anyway, looking at her discography, it's not easy to find all of her recordings, but she seems to have about a dozen albums as a leader, including a big band recording that I want to find and have a listen to as well. And so, in addition to being a pianist, she's also a really good composer. And so here, this work kind of celebrates the St. Lawrence Riverway. So if you're from New York like I am, and have been up into Canada and Montreal, that's where my ancestors came through after they rode the boat from France and made their way down into the U.S. And you go up through the Great Lakes and the Thousand Islands and all of that kind of landscape up there. And so those are reminiscences of those landscapes that are surveyed here.
Interesting.
Yeah, so in this jazz trio, with all of her original compositions, we've got also Camille Bellil on drums and Alec Walkington, which is such a great name for a bass player.
because they're walking all over that bass.
So let's dig right into these original compositions. The first track, Orange Brûlée.
Yeah.
And it's a medium swing tune. It's a really happy melody. Desmarais comes right in with the tune, has two 16-bar sections with a repeating melody idea at the start of each, which she connects into some Oscar Peterson-like runs up and down the keyboard with a flair and some syncopated phrases and chords. There's a different 8-measure bridge section that follows, and then another softer 8-measure chord section that builds up to the solos. Walkington switches up between walking and snappy syncopated lines. And Desmarais is up first for a solo, incorporating ideas from her melody, nice swing feel, fluid lines, and chiming notes as well.
Oh, beautiful tone, yeah.
Yeah, she's really nice touch there. Walkington gets a solo too. Relaxed feel, good melodic connection in his ideas. Then Desmarais and Bellil trade fours for a round with tasty drum ideas. They go around the melody sections once more with a little extra repeat of the last part into some drum fills and a cool unison piano and bass line to wrap it all up.
Yeah, she's got kind of like a pastel kind of tone to it. It's really nice.
Really good touch.
Pleasant to listen to.
Track 2, Valse Saint-Germain, and it is a waltz, but it's fast and kind of flowing. Desmarais sets it out solo with an 8-bar intro, and then bass and Bellil on brushes join in on the melody, which seems to be a 36-measure theme. Lush chords, sustained ringing and rolled figures, and syncopated soft chords mixed with runs in Desmarais' hands. It has a nice gentle motion to it. They go around again into improvisations from Desmarais with some emphasized triplet lines and ringing alternating chords and runs. Walkington gets a bass solo with nice melodies again and a syncopated push to his playing, and then Desmarais returns for some more ringing improvisations into the first section of the melody to a slowed down ending.
Yeah, so you mentioned Oscar Peterson. You hear that on the scales, and she also puts in this really nice sheen that she gets with the pedal too. It's really just all beautifully judged. Really,
everything stylized and I don't want to say measured, but with the right pedal effects and the right sustain on everything, it sounds really classy.
Yeah, listeners who listen to this podcast probably are aware that I'm really drawn to timbre in general. So a beautifully produced sound is really going to draw me in more than anything virtuosic.
And track 3, we've got the street beat. And Bellil gives a 4-bar intro, and the street beat turns out to be a funky 6-beat feeling kind of thing.
Huh.
I guess you could count it in a slower 3 too, but it's got that subdivided thing. Walkington lays down really funky bass grooves under Desmarais' melody that starts bluesy and has chords moving in steps all over the place. You'll be following it along. There's a repeating 12-measure section, and then a contrasting modulated 16-bar section with piano improv ideas on the second half before we get a repeat of that first bar 12 section. Desmarais takes a solo with great bluesy and funky ideas here, changing up to more chiming things on the contrasting section. Bellil gets to fill in some drums for an 8-bar solo over repeated chord figures, and they go around all these sections again to a sudden ending. Track 4, Promenade de la Mer. And here Desmarais starts it with a 4-bar piano intro of a rhythmic left-hand figure into chords. The bass and drums join in, bass taking her rhythmic figure and Bellil giving it a straight rock ballad kind of beat to it. The melody seems to be like 28 measures that Desmarais builds in waves of softly rocking chord figures. Her solo is very expressive, showing a soft touch in rising runs into the high register and then powerful building tides of chiming chords. At the end, it comes down soft and Walkington's ostinato stops and just rings out as it goes away.
Yeah.
And track 5.
Le Président aime chick.
Yeah, the president loves chick.
I'm kind of wondering, who does she mean? Justin Trudeau? I mean, what's she,
I don't know.
who is that?
President? The chick, obviously, Chick Corea here, though.
Yeah, we got that part.
This one's got a really driving swing tempo. The tune's built around a 16-measure modal harmony sequence. They come right in on the melody, and from the 11th bar, things get tricky with a really fast syncopation with the bass. Bellil takes over the drums until bass and piano return into alternating chords that build up the tension. The length is a little extended there in that section, and then we're off and running with Desmarais improvising ideas over the pattern. She can really connect lines well to build melodies, gets into some big dense chord ideas with driving rhythms for a while, before building up right-hand rhythmic figures into extended ideas. Bellil gets to trade eighths in some more playing over chord vamping. They connect it back to another round of the melody with the tricky drum section and alternating chords to a playful ending.
Yeah, I should mention Justin Trudeau is the prime minister, not the president, so that's got to be somebody else.
Yeah,
I don't know.
I'm not sure. Track 6, Jam Session. And, well, they do let loose on this one. Desmarais starts it out with some rising two-hand figures. Bass and drums kick in for some synced-up push into a piano run and some tinkles on the piano. Then Walkington gets a fast 3-beat ostinato going with a clicky drum beat added, and Desmarais plays some snappy rhythmic melody figures. Suddenly, things are off on a furious swing beat with walking bass, and Desmarais stretches out into some improvisations, into more of the previous snappy figures as the groove changes up. The tempo breaks up, and Desmarais plays percussive chords into waves of notes over free drumming. It gets a little delirious and seems to want to form into a kind of rubato ballad before more dissonant waves and drumming take over and then fade. Then Desmarais gets a bluesy and funky groove going for the drums and bass to join in. She jams over it with changing modal ideas and harmonic exploration. Piano drops out and the drums fade away for a freeform solo from Walkington. He's in no hurry at all with climbing lines and some triplet ideas, finishing up with some fluttering fingers. Then he returns to the 3-beat ostinato we heard earlier. We get a repeat of that section and the fast walking swing as a new extended section for Desmarais to improvise on, working up to a lot of dissonant percussive chord ideas and some rolling figures before a final bit of the snappy rhythmic melody and some skittering and ringing touches and Bellil's drum ending. It's a lot of fun, and you can finally start to see the shape of what's going on once you get to the end, as you get little sort of restatements of things you've heard before. Track 7, Paquito, and I'm going to assume this one's for Paquito de Rivera, who she's played with before, and so it's a little Latin-y tune, and Desmarais starts it with rhythmic alternating piano chords for 4 bars, bass and drums join in for another round. The intro goes on with some busy bass and then piano figures into a drum break. Bellil has a nice Latin groove working with Walkington under Desmarais' melody. I'm not sure about the construction of this song, but it seems to be like a really long, I couldn't pick out any repeating segments. So I think it's like a 50 measures of composition. It's really all about the cool Cuban rhythm figures, though, that Desmarais spices it with. There's a clean short break into another round for her to improvise, and she mixes in speedy runs with really percussive chords and tricky rhythmic ideas. They reset with the intro chord idea for 8 measures for Berlioz to work up the drums, and then take it around the melody section again with some final Cuban rhythmic grooving and a speedy punctuated finishing line. Track 8, À l'aube vers le fleuve.
Yeah.
So, at dawn, towards the river. Now listen closely on this one. Desmarais starts it with delicate, repeating rhythmic figures ringing high on the piano. Berlioz adds light dancing cymbals, and there's a strange high, I think bowed bass, kind of, I want to say atonal, but not matching the harmonies, very faintly in the background. I got the images of like birds flying over the river, like seagull calls or something like that. You'll barely hear it.
It's got to be the bass, really. Cause
maybe up on the bridge, like muted bowing or something. And now you've been put into this kind of little trance with the slow beat feel from the piano rhythm. But suddenly we get kind of a pop beat jump in with the bass and drums and rhythmic lower piano chords too. But now the new rhythm, it feels like there's a skip in the record because the new meter is, I think, 7/8. So it jumps you ahead, missing that last beat you would be feeling in the subdivision of the 4 from before. So it's kind of a cool little rhythmic trick there. They go around getting used to the new groove, and then Walkington is up for a gentle and deep bass solo. Desmarais takes over with ringing, but connected solo lines of pretty melody. She works up into really chiming, exciting chords, continues with more fast runs into more chiming ideas. Then it comes down into soft lower register piano chords, and an outro of high chimes that are like the intro, with more of that faint bowing string sound and a final upward piano trickle. And that's it. So I found Desmarais to be a really virtuosic and classy piano player. You can tell she's absorbed Kenny Barron, Chick Corea, Oscar Peterson, but she's got her own style too, and her compositions are fresh and interesting. We get some hard swinging, straight rock beats and funky grooves, some modern modal and more adventurous harmonic exploration, and Latin grooves too. Her solos are inspired with connected melodic ideas. She has a light and smooth flow when she wants it, but she can really hammer out percussive playing too. And Berlioz and Walkington fit all the grooves and styles just right, and the synergy of the trio is great.
You know, I had a funny experience with this album because I came away from it thinking, oh, it's really nice. I liked it, you know. But, yeah, I went on to the next album, and I kept referring to the other player as her. And I realized that I was still thinking of, I had to take a step away because I was still thinking of this album, Lorraine Desmarais. So it made a bigger impression on me, like deeper down than I had realized when I listened to it. And actually, I really love it when that happens. So I'll probably have to get this one and listen to it a few more times. Right. Anyway, it's got a light, like French type of sound. And it's some of the tracks are light, sunny, and fun, but the album has some more rhythmic workouts as well, like you said, with a rougher tone to them. I was drawn to her, Desmarais' warm, appealing tone, and she has shimmering scales, and I think she knows that her scales are an asset because she displays this skill really often on this album. That's an Oscar Peterson sort of styling too. She plays a lot of repeating patterns in her compositions, using those to build further with the harmony, which I rather appreciated as a big classical listener. It kept me listening, and her trio was supportive. They solo well themselves, and I think this went deeper than I thought when I first heard it. So, listener beware, you might get addicted to this one.
Yeah, check it out. She's really wonderful pianist and had a long career, but more people should hear her recordings. And I'm going to seek out some of the earlier ones as well.
There's a Christmas one. I'm always interested in those, so maybe I'll give that a listen.
Yeah, that could be good for this year's Christmas.
Next holiday season, yeah.
All right. Another player that I didn't know much about, maybe I had seen his name in passing, but this was a new recording, came out at the end of February. Grot Records. Actually, that was the listing. I'm still not sure because I found out later that it's also a GAD Records too. It's these European small labels.
It could be a different label in a different location. You don't know.
That's possible too. And then oftentimes the distributors are different. Anyway, we're going to go back to the Czech Republic for Emil Viklicky and his new recording that's out live in San Francisco.
And now you had an interaction with this guy this week, right?
We've had a lot of going back and forth. Well, of course, I was searching. This came out on the new releases, and so I started looking. I couldn't find any information at all about this recording. So I got in touch with him. I'll get to that in a moment. Anyway, if you don't know Viklicky, he was born 1948 in Olomouc, former Czechoslovakia, now the Czech Republic. He played piano from a young age, but graduated from university with a degree in mathematics.
Yeah. Well, that's not so far away from music, really.
Yeah, music is math.
Well, it's a lot of things. It's not just math.
Yeah. He won some jazz soloist awards at European festivals and competitions. And then in 1977, he was awarded a 4-year scholarship to study composition and arrangement with Herb Pomeroy at Berklee College of Music in Boston. And he continued studying composition after that. He's played around the world with jazz ensembles of various types. As a composer, his music has kind of a combination of expressive elements of modern jazz and also tonalities of Moravian folk songs. He composes straight-ahead modern jazz as well as chamber and orchestral works, and at times his music uses a combination of classical and jazz performers. And so you will pick up on some of those folk elements in this music. And if you want to hear more folk elements, tune in for next week, because I'm going to go back a couple hundred years to some more Moravian folk ideas.
Am I going to do that too?
No, that's what you're doing. Yeah.
Oh, that's what I'm doing.
Yeah.
I got to check my recordings here.
Anyway, as I said, there was very little information about this other than it was released. So I got in touch with Emil, and he was very helpful in sending information about this and his other recordings. And he also has a really good sense of humor, because he asked us if we also produced adult films.
Adult movies, he said, right?
Movies. I'm not sure. But anyway, if anyone's wondering, we're still just working on the adult audio only at this time. But I think if we get into films, I've got my first title. Since we're in Japan, that's going to be Mighty Mike Meets the Maiko.
Oh, that's actually pretty clever, and I wouldn't mind meeting them myself at this point. Yeah.
Anyway, turns out
I'll have to go to the gym if I'm gonna live up to that role. I don't know.
This recording is not a new recording, but it's never been released before. It was actually recorded in 2012.
Oh, that's a long time ago.
Frank Haney's Jazz Club. And in addition to Emil on piano, we've got Scott Amendola on drums and John Shiflett on bass. And as of now, the recording's only out electronically, but Emil says that GAD Records in Poland may issue a CD in the future. And I hope they do, because this is a really exciting live performance and really good sonics for a live recording. We've got mostly Emil's original compositions with a couple of jazz standards. And we're going to start out with one of his originals, Halloween. And this one's a medium swing, kind of post-bop sounding tune. The main melody section is 16 bars, nice harmonies and dense chords, but nothing too scary like Halloween. Good snappy bass lines from Shiflett under the piano. Then there's a kind of 10-measure bridge section that's mostly rhythmic chords and some cool left-hand piano bass lines and a big upward run of notes. Then we get the 16-bar section again. Viklicky is up for his first solo, which he keeps the same form for, going around about 3 times, and you can get a nice taste of his style here. He's very rhythmic, lots of percussive chords, synced up 2-hand figures between speedier runs, and I like how he pulls back in phrases from the melody to jump off on new ideas. He gets some blizzy hints in the second round. Shiflett gets a bass solo next, and Amendola drops out on the drums. He starts out with long, bendy notes on the bass, working into more throbbing melodic ideas with light backing from Viklicky, and Amendola returning with a light hi-hat timekeeping. And Viklicky gets trades with 8s with Amendola on drums, giving him the first or second halves of the 16-bar section to solo for a couple rounds. The crowd really likes it, and I really like how the drums sound on this live recording. They go around the melody sections once more to finish it up.
Yeah, I mentioned the drum sound too. They're really full. I said the bass drum especially is really full on the recording. I'm also kind of curious about the title Halloween. It's really an American thing. It's something we made into something. I'm kind of wondering if he picked that up from being in America for a while. I don't know. I'm kind of wondering how that got to the Czech Republic. Maybe he'll let us know.
And track 2 is kind of curious title too. Bird Flew Over.
And this is a beautiful track, actually. I liked it a lot.
I was thinking One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, or
that came to mind too.
The bird, I don't know. Anyway, so Viklicky starts it out solo with an 8-bar intro. Bass and drums join in softly, and actually it turns out that this whole tune is built around a really sweet 8-bar chord sequence that's minor and bluesy, but has a nice lifting or mood-lifting turns to the harmony in the 3rd and 6th measures. Viklicky gives us a couple rounds of the restrained and melancholy melody before launching off into improvisations. He shows off light and ringing articulation with bluesy and snappy right-hand figures. Amendola and Shiflet shift gears and give it a double-time feel. Then Viklicky gets just the right amount of space between his phrases to build up anticipation. There's a great climax in this tune, in the solo, right about 3 minutes and 10 seconds, with these rising two-handed figures. They're synced up into some real high-register bluesiness. Someone in the crowd shouts out, "Yeah!" at the appropriate moment, and I agree. They bring it down softer, downshifting to the original tempo. Viklicky has a great descending cascade to bring in a solo from Shiflet. He makes it snappy and bluesy, and then they go around the melody a couple times to a crowd-pleasing ending with some final emphatic chords and tinkles on the piano.
I like it when the crowd can't contain themselves. They have to just sort of say something. I wish that would happen more in classical music, but at the end of the work, please. Yeah. Only at the end. Even between movements, sometimes you get this big build-up at the end of a classical movement, and then everybody just kind of sits there quietly. Like, it just doesn't feel natural to me. You should
too much
cheer
restraint,
for those two if it's really good.
Track 3 here is Gone with Water, and Viklicky starts it with a series of downward cascades of notes, like water falling from higher and higher places, like you're looking up on some mountainside or something. He gets a 6-note ostinato going that Shiflet joins in on. They work over that with 16 measures of chiming chords. Then Viklicky gets us an 8-measure minor waltz melody with a very folk-like quality to it here. I could pick up on that. He goes around twice before improvising on it and finding all the bluesy implications in the right spots. His solo is a nice mix of more flowing melodic high lines, super funky and punchy chords, and bluesy licks. He brings it down soft for Shiflet to get a bluesy and funky solo with lots of snappy licks, and then he picks it up again on piano with more percussive bluesy jamming, and Amendola has lots of cool drum fills going on. They bring back the ostinato introduction and chiming chords into a few final runs of the folky melody. Track 4 is called Highlands, Lowlands. Here Viklicky starts it out solo with sets of modulating, ringing, rhythmic figures before getting into tempo with a ringing rhythmic riff that the drums and bass join in on, and then it repeats. The meter seems to be 6/4, and the melody is a 16-measure construction, has chiming climax in the 11th bar, and comes down softer at the end of the phrase. They go around it a few times before Viklicky works off into improvisations. He finds bluesy spots and really digs in with percussive rhythmic playing and ringing high-register notes. Shiflet gets a solo next, starting with some throbbing interval ideas into lines that dig down low and into repeated licks. Then Viklicky returns with more percussive playing on rounds of the melody. Amendola getting lots of dancing cymbals behind. They take it into a bluesy vamp section over a bass ostinato with Viklicky hammering away and Amendola mixing it up. Then they bring it down soft and take it out with a couple repeats of the final 4 measures of the melody, and the crowd approves. Track 5, Love, Oh Love. This one, Viklicky starts out with some repeating and alternating minor ostinato 3/4 figures and downward trickles. Shiflet joins the ostinato. Viklicky works some ornamented improvisation and more trickles while Amendola gets the cymbals dancing. Then we get the minor folk-sounding 16-measure melody, another section of ostinato and trickles, and another melody run. It modulates, and Viklicky is off and running on a solo full of rhythmic excitement and percussive piano. They bring it down soft, and Amendola pulls out for a solo from Shiflet. He comes up with some complex rhythmic ideas and ends up in some throbbing notes and intervals. They make a reset with the ostinato and trickles again with some improvisations from Viklicky that build in intensity, leaving gaps of anticipation into some very cool two-handed bluesy riffs. One more ostinato reset into a final run through the melody. Track 6, At Donau, at Pressburg. Viklicky starts the longing minor intro alone, and Shiflet joins in subtly and then gets more ringing. The melody is a 16-measure construction with a lifting change to major in the 12th bar. They go around and around, Amendola joining in softly with brushes. The fun here is how this transforms from a mournful ballad and gradually gathers steam into a swinging and a double-time feeling chug to mine all the bluesy implications out of the harmonies. More great percussive playing, but some happy melody ideas and smooth-flowing sustained right hand and ringing ideas too. They soften it for a Shiflet bass solo and then get back into bluesy groove for some more piano jamming. Back to the simply stated slow melody on just piano and bass and a trickling ending from Viklicky, and the crowd cheers away again at this one.
They're pretty enthusiastic crowd.
Yeah, it would have been a great night
really,
to be there.
Yeah, you don't hear the golf clap in this, that you hear in a lot of jazz clubs.
Enthusiasm.
They really have enthusiasm.
Yeah, this is a good crowd. Track 7, now we're going to go off from the originals to a Duke Ellington tune, Solitude. Everyone knows this one, and it's a really nice original arrangement of it here. They give a kind of original anticipation-building intro of repeated rising bass and piano lines with little piano sprinkles. Then Viklicky releases the familiar melody, great ringing bass from Shiflet, and they bring back the little intro lick between phrases in the spaces. It picks up a bit of chug from Amendola's brushes and spots, but it kind of ebbs back. Classy phrasing and nice touch in the high register from Viklicky, but he adds a lot of excitement with punchy chords and bluesy licks in his solo. One more hint from the intro idea and a sudden soft piano figure into a solo from Shiflet that starts very intimately but then busts out with snappy accented melody phrases. There's a little riff reset and Viklicky jams a bit over the final section of the melody into another start of the melody line, but they finish it up with repeats of the rising intro riffs. Yeah, very classy. Track 8, another original longing. It's a solo piano, descending trickling figures that start from higher up, makes an intro into a waltzing minor 16-measure melody that twists into major in the 5th measure and comes back again. Bass and drums join in on the repeat, and Viklicky is going to take this to some different places. Again, he finds the bluesy implications and adds some delicate and ringing melodic figures. He can't resist digging in with great percussive chord build-ups, and he rips out some really smooth runs in here too. There's a soft return to a melody snippet that gets Shiflet going on a bluesy bass solo, ending in a big gliss up from a low note. They return to the melody for another couple runs with some extra harmonic color and a tasty, trickly playing at the end from Viklicky. And we're going to close out the recording with a Gershwin tune, Who Cares? Yeah. Old jazz standard, and then give it an up-tempo swing treatment. Nice snappy right-hand figures in the melody. He launches right into a solo with lots of rhythmic energy and chiming high-register right-hand notes. His hand interplay is really great here. Shiflet is up next for a bass solo, mostly walks away with a few extra snaps in it. And then Viklicky trades up 8s with Amendola to get some drum soloing with tasty tom work. One more time around the melody into some final piano improvisation and fun little harmonically tense coda ending to finish it up. So it was a high-energy night in San Francisco. Really good sound quality for a live recording. 2 standards, with most of the tunes being Viklicky's originals. And you can really pick up on the folk flavors in his melodies. And mostly they can take a short, simple melody, 8 or 16 bars, and transform it into something really exciting over the performance of a tune. When he solos, Viklicky often finds the blues and injects rhythmic energy with percussive chords. He's always full of ideas, and Amendola and Shiflet lock in very well, and they follow the transformation of the tunes with kind of implicit communication of where it's going. The crowd had a great time, and you will too if you give this one a listen.
Yeah, this is a pretty exciting recording, and I actually enjoyed the depth that Viklicky has in his playing. He he builds a lot on. I was kind of thinking of the Desmarais, because she does something similar. She'll build on like these repeating patterns, and he'll have like a motif that he'll build on and branch out from there. And he switches styles a lot too, and sometimes playing several at once. I was thinking of the repeating upward motif in Solitude, which kind of sounds classical to me, along with the more lightly swinging theme that he's that he's playing. So I just noticed that as well. It's pretty interesting. There's a lot of creativity in his soloing once he gets going. And often he'll get going because the accompanying bass and drums nudge him onward. I noticed this too. Like he'll be playing and then the other guys will like pick up the tempo and he'll be right there with it. Sometimes it's him that picks them up. It's all pretty fascinating, all the communication between the three of them, which is really right on the surface. I mean, you can kind of tell when it's happening. The bass always solos over a slowed down tempo. Did you notice that?
It always does, yeah.
I was
kind of
expected
that after a while.
I guess he likes that. He's got a lot of space.
Could be,
But I thought that was really interesting. Yeah, so they play well off each other, and you get the impression that the playing would be totally different if any of these musicians were changed.
Yeah.
It would just have a completely different sound world. So this is something kind of unique with these three people there. It's a bit out of the ordinary too, so I rather liked it for that. It was really interesting for that, all those reasons.
Yeah, and we had a few email exchanges with Emil. He's got lots of other recordings that you can find on streaming. He especially recommends a recording that he did with American trumpeter Marcus Printup, and it's on a Jazz at the Castle series from 2007. It's on the Swedish label Fog Arts, although I see it listed under Multisonic on Deezer. Maybe that's the distributor. And I strongly recommend a duo recording. I sent
me this one.
Yeah, with bass clarinetist Pavel Hruby
because
in 2020.
Because we love the bass clarinet so much.
It's called Between Us, and it's on Amplion Records. Distributor seems to be Studio Svengali on streaming. So that's a really kind of intimate duo recording. Really nice. Although most of his recordings have been on these European labels that don't get international distribution. But
they can't find a home. They just got to go from label to label.
But now it's the streaming age, and that's why we're here. That's what I do every day when I wake up really early and spend about an hour searching through all the new releases from all corners of the globe. Does the globe have corners? I don't know. Ends of the earth.
Why do they say that?
I don't know.
Yeah, is that like a flat Earth thing? Like corners of the globe? What are they talking about?
Too. Anyway, I'm always looking, and I was really happy to find
all the curves of the globe. Let's say that
curves. Way. So there you go. Canada, Czech Republic, great pianists everywhere. But let's return to the U.S. for the final trio, something completely different in approach with a younger pianist who's making a big name for himself. And this is Julian Shore on Tone Rogue Records. That's a good label name. And just called Trio, because it's a piano trio. And if you don't know Julian Shore yet, he's making a name for himself. Born in 1987 in Narragansett, Rhode Island. After starting piano lessons at a young age, he studied with educator Hal Crook as a teenager, and he got a full scholarship to Berklee College of Music, where he enrolled in the fall of 2005. And while he was there, under the mentorship of Danilo Perez, he performed in a young musicians ensemble in the Panama Jazz Festival, learning from Wayne Shorter, Brian Blade, and others. We get a Wayne Shorter tune or version of a tune on this recording. And since 2010, he's continued to appear both as a leader and a sideman in New York, where he's based, and playing internationally. Among his own recordings as a leader, his debut was Filaments in 2012, Which Way Now, 2016, and Where We Started in 2020. And here's his new one, Trio, Shore on piano, Martin Nevin on bass, and Alan Midnard on drums. And Shore says of this recording, quote, "A few months ago, Martin, Alan, and I went into the studio without much of a plan besides playing some tunes I like. We had a lot of fun, and it's nice to just record without expectations and see what happens and release it. I hope that spirit comes off in the music and that you enjoy listening." This spontaneous spirit of working mostly from, it seems like, sketches of tunes and just seeing what happens spontaneously is what I think defines this recording. Something going to be different from the previous two we just discussed. All right, we're going to start. Oh, there's another French word here. Lend me your pronunciation.
Feuillette d'album, which is an album leaf.
Album leaf.
Like a page in a book.
Yeah, and I guess in classical music, this means a minor composed piece.
It's a one-page piece that you wrote for somebody. You know?
Yes, that a composer wrote for someone for some occasion. And anyway, this one is Alexander Scriabin. And this is a really minor piece. It's very pretty harmonic sequence, but it seems to be just 4 measures. But just like we heard with previous recording, you can take a small snippet and take it some places. And so Shore gets it going with a rubato solo intro of this very short musical phrase. As I said, it seems like just 4 bars, but he gets it into a slow tempo for another round, and then the bass and drums join in for a few more, and they slow it down on the 3rd time through. One more time at tempo, and then Nevin is up for a bass solo. His tone really rings out with clean attacks as he works up pleading lines into the upper register. And Shore is next for some improvisations, making flowing, delicate lines and some rhythmically free phrases. Bernard is mixing up some textures with brushes underneath all that. Then Shore brings back the melody phrases, and Nevin adds nice bass counterlines underneath that. They slow it down into a rubato and colorfully trickling solo ending from Shore. It's gentle and nice, and as I said, as we heard from Viklitsky's tunes earlier, getting a lot of musical expression starting with just a simple idea. Track 2 is Casa Oscura, so Dark House, I guess. And this is from Mark Turner, the saxophonist, his composition. It's a rubato intro with delicate synced bass and piano lines into piano figures that start to swell. Bernard adds dancing cymbals and toms. At about 50 seconds or so, there's a pause and hesitated piano figure that take it into an Viklicky kind of Latin-feeling beat. Bernard and Nevin are locked into a tight groove, but Shore floats the melody with a soft touch over that for a dreamy atmosphere. They take an in-tempo break, but can still hear the faint counting out before Shore moves into improvisations. He has a light touch, and his free-flowing lines are smooth, ending in some more percussive chords before another section of more soft chords and rolling as the tempo becomes free and they continue on rubato, but reaching heavier chords with drum fills to an ending of piano trickles over ringing bass figures. We're going to get a Julian Shore original idea for composition, Unsaid, a sparse and soft piano opening that has alternating notes that turn to chords under delicate piano figures that build and release harmonic tension. After a minute, the alternating chords move to more changing harmonies, and Nevin comes in with a solid bass note kind of feel, locked in with Shore's movement. Bernard sprinkles in cymbals, accents, and fills, and Shore's melody is spare, rather, and chordy. A clicky groove develops under Shore's sparse but rhythmic improvisations, and Bernard embellishes with fills as the push gets heavier. Shore gets into more weighty and accented chords as it approaches the sudden and then soft ending. Track 4, there's 2 of these here. This is Skin 1. I think it's built off an idea from the pianist Jerry Allen. This one will shake you up with the furious, busy bass and drum action after the previous dreamier material.
Yeah, it kind of lulled me out of my relaxed state there.
Yeah.
Like, what's happening here?
For a bit, Nevin gets a 6-beat ostinato going in the bass, but that will soon get morphed into more complex things, and he's freed up from that. Shore launches speedy flowing lines over chords with spaces between his phrases. He connects ideas more in the middle register, and the tempo breaks up until he gets a new rhythmic 3-beat figure going, and Nevin and Bernard build a new busy beat around it. Shore keeps the left hand going and adds a new bouncy rhythmic figure in his right hand as they approach the ending in just under 2 minutes. So it's a short piece. We're going to get a Tonino Horta, the Brazilian guitar singer-composer tune, De Tom Pra Tom. And this one's gets like a slow waltz tempo and dreamy atmosphere. Nevin's anticipation of the downbeat, even at this tempo, gives it kind of a forward motion, though. Shore treats the melody gently, but builds lush chords around it. Bernard has soft hits that mark out the beat. They have pauses that give it a sense of breathing in the phrases before it continues. Nevin has a bass solo with a vocal pleading quality to his melodic phrases. He gets more push going into a solo from Shore that has softly floating, sometimes ringing and rolling ideas, showing off dynamics and a variety of touch in his piano playing. He works it into more of a rhythmic groove between his hands for a bit before some chiming melody to a soft ending. Track 6 is Skin 2. Another version of this Jerry Allen idea. This time there's a different light and metallic clinky 3-beat drum groove to start and no bass. Shore introduces a short, syncopated Latin-sounding figure and adds other chord ideas between repeats of it. Nevin joins in on bass, starting with an interval idea and working into an ostinato. They get a groove going with Shore working the Latin figure and then getting some busy bouncing chord ideas to another quick ending, just over 2 minutes this time. And we'll get a standard Cole Porter's Everything I Love for track 7. So rubato but brisk solo piano start from Shore, a gentle touch on the melody but quickly shifting chords and a nice touch with little leading left-hand bass lines. On the last phrase, Shore gives it more of a push and then Midnard locks in the tempo on tight hi-hat with Nevin giving it a bouncy bass pulse. Shore floats freely over the busy bass, sometimes with more rhythmically snapping lines and chords, and Nevin rings out some solo bass before they take one more easy jaunt through the melody. Track 8, this is the Wayne Shorter tune, but it's actually kind of a traditional Irish folk song idea.
And you hear the Irish folk song melody in there. I can pull it out, yeah.
And that's She Moves Through the Fair. And this is on, I know he recorded this on, what was that one recent...
Wayne Shorter, you mean?
Yeah.
Recorded this? What, one of the new ones?
Covers, yeah. Eminon, is that it?
Oh, is this on Eminon?
Yeah, it is, I believe.
Oh, wow.
Anyway, okay. Midnard gives this a light, clicky, even drum beat, and Nevin plays ringing bass ideas under soft chord ideas from Shore, who then builds phrases of left-hand melody before moving to softer and higher melody and chords. They let him float solo for a while before Nevin returns with throbbing bass pulse, and Midnard adds a busier drum beat. Shore builds into some zigzagging ideas for a bit and phrases and chords. They give it a soft reset for a more delicate piano melody before starting a more clicky groove, this time for Shore to get more rhythmic over and add thicker chords. Midnard builds things up and down again a few times, and Shore builds to heavier percussive chords, and they take it out with a soft but rhythmic interaction to a fade out. And we're going to finish up with Unsaid 2, another Julian Shore piece. This one, Shore starts with a repeating series of 3 notes that then resolve harmonically to a single note. Midnard adds a clicky groove, and Nevin adds a rhythmic bass riff idea to match Shore's sequence. It gets very hypnotic in a 6-beat slow groove. Nevin morphs the riffs into new ideas, including some cool glisses and really high percussive plucks. He then gets lower and sparse as it quiets to the end. So, it's not totally amorphous, but definitely free-flowing in approach. The tune's really starting points for what kind of spontaneous interplay can come from this trio. And Shore seems very well suited for this environment. He has interesting chord voicings and soft and smooth articulation with a really light touch. His phrasing can float loose over tighter grooves underneath and explore and then connect ideas back without really having a specific endpoint, it seems, in mind. Things go in interesting directions, and it will take your willingness to follow and concentration to get the most out of listening to this recording. Midnard and Nevin are sensitive players, adjusting to what develops, and the overall sense of communication between the trio is impressive. I recommend it for listeners who like things a little bit on the freer and flowing side.
Freer flowing? I thought like mellow, actually. It's got... Most of it has like this late night closing time vibe, where you're staring into your empty glass.
Yeah,
before they make you leave. Anyway, it's relaxing for the most part, and also well recorded, we have to say. For me, the bass came up exceptionally well on the recording, and that's also because of the expansive tone the bass player gets. He's got this gigantic, big, fat tone. The piano has a full tone too, and the chords, it's really recorded close, and it sounds really rich. I liked it a lot. The chords are all warm. There are a lot of ideas in the piano playing too, and I like the way he'll subtly reharmonize or change the voicing, in the same harmony, like each time we hear it. It's really subtle, but you never really hear the melody repeat, but it's never really harmonized in quite the same way. So I thought that was imaginative and very subtle too. A lot of people won't notice it if they're just kind of having it in the background. I don't know. It's got a nice glow to it, so I thought it was nice. Yeah, I liked his reharmonization of the. Well, he didn't reharmonize. He just kind of changed the voices. They're still the same chords, but he just kind of changed the way he plays them.
Subtleness in his playing. It's not nothing show-offy, but the gentleness and sort of going with the flow and letting the ways of taking this melody in different directions is really kind of interesting. It'd take a few listens, I think, to get the most out of what's going on here.
Yeah, so we had a lot of records tonight that had that are going to require a bit of repeated listening to really get a lot out of them.
I think so.
And they invite that. And that's always a good thing, because there's always something new to discover. That's a record that's worth buying, because you know you're going to get something new out of it each time you listen.
And so there you have it. That's episode 106. Lots of really cool keyboard things, and one might even say crazy keyboards.
Crazy keyboards? All right. Well, we went to the Keyboard Museum in the classical.
That's for sure. Yeah,
tonight,
Keyboard
that's for
Museum.
Sure. Yeah.
Lots of things there, and a little trip to the Czech Republic, and we're going to go back again next week.
Oh, more to Czech Republic, huh? Oh.
Yeah. We've got the new Rundfunk coming up.
Oh, we do? Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. See that?
Although that was Bohemian back then, wasn't it? I don't know. Anyway.
It's hard to say. Yeah, I think it was Czech. And we're going to hear from the...
now that you said that, we're going to hear from Daniel. Because he's always making sure we get our Rundfunk facts right.
Yeah, and we're going to hear Marek conducting again, anyway, with Volume 5 of that really nice recording. And so I'm interested to give it a detailed listening. Right. We've covered all the previous ones until now. And in jazz, I'm going to go for some mixture of things that came out last month. I've got a flute recording, I got a vibes recording with piano, and I've got a trumpet recording. So sort of some of my favorite sounding recent releases. You can look forward to that.
Yeah, next week we're finally getting to that Caroline Shaw album, The Wheel on Alpha, that I mentioned in January. I said, we'll do this. And now it's the end of March and I'm finally getting to it. And we're going to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Thomas Weelkes and William Byrd's deaths next week with an album of their music too.
400 years.
400 years.
Amazing.
1623 they died.
Wow. So all that to look forward to. If you want to check out those recordings ahead of time, not too long after this episode gets published, I'll put up the playlist for that on Deezer and a link to it on Facebook, so you can find it in one of those two places. And before we sign out, as always, thanks to Fast Signs of Staten Island for our glowing neon logo and our continual encouragement of improving our New York accents. We know we got to work on that, so we'll just keep working on those things. As well as...
That's a good thing to be getting rid of, to be honest.
The previously mentioned podcasts, if you stick on this far in the podcast, you'll be sure to listen to the ending, and you'll get a little snippet of a promo from each one and see if they sound interesting to you. If so, do check them out during the week. And remember, also find those links to the two recordings from John Krosnick's bands, The Charged Particles and the Lunar Octet. I think you'll like those Michael Brecker tunes and some Latin jazz. And that's it.
Yeah, that is it.
Yeah. So we'll see you again next week for episode 107. Lots of new music and more good things to come this spring. So until then, keep listening, and we'll see you again next time.
Gerald Albright, Maria Schneider, Charlie Hunter, Hoop Robillard, Sean Jones, Walter Beasley, Steve Swallow. Something Came from Baltimore is a jazz, blues, and R&B podcast and radio show, and it's not really about Baltimore. Subscribe to the podcast and listen to your favorite artist or future favorite artist. That's Something Came from Baltimore. And be a part of that Be More music scene. Joe Lovano, Jeff Compton, Paula Cole, Danuzo Makatani, Ann Passio, Ches Smith, Thumbscroll, mostly.
Hi, jazz fans. This is the founder and host of Neon Jazz, Joe Domino. It's both a weekly radio show and interviews with musicians from all over the world, like the Netherlands, New York City, and back to Kansas City, the home of Neon Jazz, covering the rich history and modern world of jazz in a fresh way, featuring interviews with the likes of Arturo Sandoval, Sonny Rollins, Maria Schneider, and countless others. Find our weekly show on Mixcloud. Subscribe to the interviews via iTunes and YouTube. We are Neon Jazz.
Same difference. Two jazz fans, one jazz standard. A review of a single jazz standard through music, history, and stories. And this is AJ.
And this is Johnny.
If you are a jazz fan and you like jazz standards, bebop, show tunes, ballads, you name it.
Yeah, we've got them here. We drop a new show on you every other week, and we take a standard and we listen to a few different versions of it.
Same difference.
Come join the fun.
Looking forward to seeing you.